Speak bold, ain't tripping on the haters. It could take freedom from a cold dead hands. We're locked and loaded for the last dance. 'Cause we're the new American gangsters, ready to die for this man.
Afternoon, America. Welcome back to another episode of We the People USA Alliance podcast. What we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about the 2022 election in Maricopa County, the election that should have never been certified by the Board of Supervisors. We're going to start, though, by chatting about a couple of things, namely, Shelby, Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles, right? She was out of the country. You remember the fires that ravaged Southern California?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she was out of the country, right, on some vacation to Africa or something like that.
Yes, she was.
And so maybe why she's supporting what is happening in L.A. right now is maybe she's trying to catch up. She misses the fire. She missed the fire, so she wants to see him, and that's why she's helping burn the city of Los Angeles to the ground.
Well, and they're literally creating fires. They're burning. I saw on a live feed kind of aerial view of downtown LA where they were stacking wood and pallets and traffic cones into the middle of the road, and they had a big bonfire just bellowing this black smoke. So maybe that is the deal. Maybe they're trying to make the mayor feel, more at home.
Mayor more at home. Got to warm her up a little bit. Yeah, and it's funny. Aren't many of these groups involved in all of these riots? Aren't they supposed to be a pro, environmental group?
No, most of their sponsors are like this Green New Deal,
right?
Green energy,
right.
Citizens for, I don't know, a better tomorrow, whatever you call those words. And they're burning mass amounts of plastic. I was watching it last night thinking, can you imagine the toxins being released into the air from these big orange traffic cones that they're throwing out there?
It sort of indicates they don't really give a damn about the health, welfare, and safety of their people, the people that live in their community. But I'm not showing that I'm actually...
You're live. I have you right here.
Live on both of our feeds. And so... here's what's going on, America, and I just want to say this really quickly. Here's what's taking place, right? This is a whole bunch of non-governmental organizations.
197 that they've admitted to.
197 non-governmental organizations, many of them that are funded by your taxpayer dollars, right? This is what the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department were doing in foreign countries in the 90s and the 2000s and the 2000s and teens to overthrow governments, right? They would use your taxpayer dollars like they're doing now. Mm-hmm. They would create and fund these non-governmental organizations, and they would create, hundreds of them. Right, so that they could get, if each group gets, 1,000 people out to protest, then it looks like a whole bunch of diverse interests coming out and protesting against the current administration, right?
Absolutely.
And so what they want to do, America, is they want to wear you down. They want you to cry uncle. They want to burn your stores. They want to loot your stores. They want to destroy your communities until you say, okay, we've had enough. We'll accept whatever changes, you want. They want to wear you out. And that's what their goal is. Right?
Absolutely.
Right.
I mean, I don't know what you've seen aside from the bricks being thrown at the officers and the police cars being overtaken. Did you see all the graffiti all over the buildings?
Yeah.
I mean, they were vandalizing private and public businesses.
Right. Because they don't care about members of their community. They care about one thing, and that's what Karen Bass, right? Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles, she came out and said, ordered Trump to withdraw from L.A. or the violence will escalate, right? Karen Bass is part of this. One of the major organizations that's brought all of these NGOs together was funded by Gavin Newsom to the tune of, what was it, 34 million U.S. taxpayer dollars. Right, and the organization's name is Churla, which is affiliated with Karen Bass. And so this is what their goal is, folks. This is terrorism, right? Terrorism is the use of violence or the threatened use of violence to achieve a political end. And these people have a political end of destroying MAGA and denying President Trump his powers of the presidency.
Oh, absolutely. Look, Steve was telling me yesterday, we were listening to interviews with some of these people and how they were saying, this wouldn't be necessary without Trump.
Right.
And so he brought up, have you ever seen Freedom Tunes, Brian?
Freedom Tunes?
Freedom Tunes. They do kind of these, it's like a cartoon meme. And they have pictures of protesters beating up, or like cartoons of protesters beating up old ladies and saying, why is Trump making me do this? Right. And that's what this is. It's like all this violence is because of Trump.
It's all because
because of Trump.
Right.
And that's the narrative that they really want to paint.
Yeah.
And we've got Governor Newsom, who is the crux of a lot of this. A lot of these protesters are saying, well, I'm out here because our governor doesn't want the National Guard here. And so we're defending our state and our governor from the National Guard and from the Trump tyranny.
Right. Well, this is Governor Gavin Newsom running for president of the United States, right? This is the kickoff of his presidential campaign because I guarantee you he's going to run. And this is his effort to put himself in the national spotlight, right? As a hero, he's trying to act like, Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Make My Day and all the Hollywood actors, whatever. He's trying to act up. And this is Gavin Newsom fueling the flames of a fire that he and Mayor Bass started. They started this fire, and they're not helping put it out. They don't want to put it out. People of California, Mayor Bass in L.A. doesn't want to put this fire out. She wants California to burn, and she wants to be able to blame Trump for the carnage. The Governor Gavin Newsom does not want the violence to end. He wants it to continue so that he can try to score political points.
Well, it's not unlike what they've done throughout history, right? I mean, it's a militarized kind of arm of the leftist party,
right?
Similar to how they incorporated the KKK. I mean, it was the Democrat Party.
Right.
And members of the Democrat Party who wanted to keep power that created the KKK. And then we fast forward, we had Antifa, right? These are just militarized factions to create chaos and confusion, right? What did you call it? The color revolution, right?
Yeah, color revolution, like what they did in the Ukraine. Right, during the Obama administration. And that's why we have, of course, that's why Kiev is burning tonight as well. Because the United States led a coup against the elected government of the Ukraine so that they could get Ukraine to agree to a trade deal with the Western Alliance countries, right, and to leave, Russia. And so this was all about, market economics, the United States and the Western European countries playing on the Ukraine in an effort to get access to the Ukraine's massively abundant resources, right? And so they're attempting to stage a coup in the United States, and that's exactly what this is. This is absolutely no different than the terrorism they engaged in prior to the 2020 election. Remember that? America's cities were burning, right?
And the unfortunate thing is it's not much different from what they do in foreign countries. It's actually so similar. The same people are funding it.
Right.
The federal government, right? I mean, our tax dollars are funding a large majority of them.
USAID. A lot of USAID money has been pushed out to these organizations, including Soros organizations, that still have billions of these USAID dollars that they're pumping into the United States right now. And watch, America, just watch what happens this Saturday, right, when they have their anti-Kings rally, right? You're going to see the same signs, right, produced by the same people. This is a very heavily centralized and organized effort to basically overthrow the government of the United States of America and deny President Trump the powers of the presidency. That's exactly what's taking place.
Well, that's why it really amazes me that there are people out there still, after what they've seen, that deny the possibility that there are people in our government that would want to somehow influence the results of our election, right? They're willing to burn down cities. They're willing to destroy public property, use tax dollars to overthrow foreign regimes.
Right.
But they would never engage in anything against our election.
CISA would never target our election machinery and virtual private networks to affect the outcome of an election. Of course not. They would never do that. You can trust them. They're from the government, right?
Well, speaking of trusting them,
right,
and manipulation of elections, should we go ahead and bring our guest on? What do you think?
We can bring him on. You want to introduce him?
I would love to introduce him.
Go ahead.
So joining us today via link is Dr. Walter Dougherty. Now, Dr. Walter Dougherty isn't just your average election integrity warrior out there. He is a computer consultant and mathematics expert who is a senior lecturer emeritus for the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at Texas A&M. He graduated from Oklahoma Christian University with a degree in mathematics, and then later earned his master's and doctorate degree from Harvard University. He is also a lifelong member of the American Mensa Association. So this is a man with some pretty distinguished credentials, wouldn't you say?
I would say 100% indeed, but Harvard, I'll bet you money it comes out that a lot of these riots that are going to take place are going to have some connection to Harvard. I'll bet you money. What do you think?
I say we stay tuned for next week's episode.
Yeah.
We'll find out the ties between Harvard and these radical riots.
But I want to welcome you as well, Walter. It's a pleasure having you. It's good to see you again. Sorry for the delays, but we were having some issues going live on X, and so we've got those resolved now, and we can chat with you. But I do want to say, Walter, the very fact that we have to have you here with your extensive credentials in computer science and technology and all of this stuff sort of indicates the problem with our election, right? If we have to have someone with the power of your brain to understand what's going on with our elections, how in the name of God can the average American citizen actually see or understand what's going on, especially when they're stuck on CNN or MSNBC or some other mainstream media that doesn't report on what's taking place? So the fact that we have to have you here indicates the most fundamental problem I think we have with our election. What do you think about that?
Well, you're absolutely right. And thanks, Brian and Shelby and Steve, for having me on. It's really a question of transparency. So if you think about how elections used to be when I was a boy, I can remember trailing along my parents going to vote, and they filled out their pieces of paper and put them in locked boxes. And then the neighbors from the precinct, who were the poll judges, opened the boxes at the end of the day and counted them. And it was 100% transparent. And what we have now is almost 0% transparent. So
Right.
all we really know now is that ballots go into the machine and results come out, but we
Right.
have no idea what goes on in between. Was my vote counted? Was it altered?
Mm-hmm.
Was it deleted? You have no
And
way of knowing. And so that
and
loss
that's
of
all
transparency,
that
it
that
leads to
that's
so
all
many problems.
determined by millions of lines of computer code, isn't it?
It
You
is,
know,
and that again is kind of a red flag, because if
right.
you think about how you count an election, you read a ballot, and if there are two candidates, A and B, if the bubble for A is filled in and the bubble for B is not, you add 1 to the total for A. And if the bubble for B is filled in and the bubble for A is not, you add 1 to B. If both bubbles are filled in, you say overvote, skip this race, go on to the next contest. If both bubbles are blank, you don't count anything. That's maybe 100 lines of code. It's
Right.
not 2 or 3 million lines of code. So what else is going on in all of that code? We don't know for
And yet,
sure, but we did get a peek. And when Tina Peters made a backup in Mesa County, Colorado, and
uh-huh.
there were unauthorized databases, basically 2 sets of books and election records were deleted. And that was the start of the troubles in Colorado.
Right.
So we all first met. Well, Brian and I already knew each other, and Steve, but we met you because you came on board to help out when we did the Kerry Lake trials here in Arizona. And so you're very familiar, aren't you, with some of the issues that occurred with these ballot on demand printers and the 19-inch definition ballots and just the big debacle of Maricopa County, correct?
Uh, yes, in fact, the very first election, I retired in 2019 after 37 years of teaching, the last 32 at Texas A&M, and thought I was going to have a quiet, uneventful life. And then 2020 happened, and a friend of mine in Pima County was running for office. And so after the election, I said, hey, I'm a math and computer guy. Can you get me some data? And so as a candidate, he got a copy of the cast vote record, which is just a list of how every ballot voted. There's no personally identifiable information on it. It's like a spreadsheet. The first row is how the first ballot voted. The second row is how the second ballot voted. And I started looking at this data, and there were 9 or 10 precincts that had more votes than registered voters. I said, something's wrong here. And my friend said, oh no, people were really engaged this election. I said, you didn't hear what I said. There were more votes than registered voters in these precincts. Something is wrong here. And I kept digging and kept finding more things. Went into Maricopa County data, found almost exactly the same patterns of manipulation. Then I was an expert witness for Kerry Lake's first lawsuit with Mark Finchen, and then again worked with your team and others after the 2022 election.
Yeah. Yeah. It's quite interesting. You know, before we sort of leave the topic of the complexity of our election systems, can we go to the whiteboard, Steve? I want to sort of just do a really quick overview, right? Because the way you explained it, you know, when you were a young man, and, you know, in my entire voting history, I would go to a designated precinct where people from my community were working. They would check my ID. They would give me a ballot. They would stick it in a locked box. And by the end of the night, they would have all of the ballots counted. And then they send them into, they would radio them in, email them in, whatever the totals from each precinct into the central count facility. And that was a very decentralized election, right? Very difficult to affect the outcome of the election in big races in a decentralized election, isn't it?
That's right. So when you have a concentration of control in anything, then that gives you a single point with a massive amount of control over the whole system. When you have it decentralized, then each precinct is basically operating on its own, and it's much harder to affect because it requires more people modifying results in more locations.
Well, that's kind of interesting you say that before Steve goes to the whiteboard, because that is what those that argue against the things that we say use. They say, oh, you believe all of these election workers all over the place and all of these vote centers are colluding. But the reality is the way the system is designed, it's not even necessary. These workers don't have to be involved or play a role in the manipulation of the elections. It can happen right in front of their face without them even knowing. Isn't that correct?
Well, it only takes one programmer.
Yeah, one programmer.
Right. So it doesn't have to be a massive collusion of everyday citizens.
Yeah. And so, Steve, let's go to the whiteboard. Okay, so we got my whiteboard up here. And so I have what, is this is a cloud, right? I don't know if you remember what's her name, Vice President Harris, when she was talking about how our data is stored now, and she was all, oh, it's somewhere up here in the cloud. We don't have to worry about space anymore because it's just like floating up there in space. And so this is where Kamala Harris, thinks all of our data is stored. Is not really a cloud, right? It's a network of computers where our data is stored, and it's simply referred to the cloud because they're all connected by network. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, generally speaking, the cloud is the network, public and private networks, and servers that are attached to it.
Right. And then you see here, I've got this little one drawn in red. I call it a virtual private network. And is that what our election systems run on, a virtual private network?
Yes, it's like a private piece of the internet.
Okay, so a private piece of the internet that's got a little bit more security to it?
It does, although there are different types of VPNs, some that you can get for free, some you pay money for, and some of them are more secure than others. But the basic idea is that they have more security than just the ordinary public internet connection. Right.
And so we know from the primary election in 2024 in Arizona, and I'm not sure if you heard about it or not, but during the election, people would go to their vote center. Where's their vote center down here? These are vote centers. Vote center. And I just got 5 vote centers written up here. They got more than that in Maricopa County. And so people were going to their vote centers, and they were unable. They have these what are called poll books that basically attach to Maricopa County's technical center right here via this virtual private network that's running in the cloud. And so people weren't able to vote. Shelby, do you remember the name of that hack?
Yeah, it was during the primary, which is kind of consistent with what we saw previous elections. Is during the primaries there were these issues, and it was CrowdStrike,
right?
And it was that CrowdStrike that shut down airplanes and everything.
It shut down airplanes. It shut down hospitals, and people weren't allowed to vote. And so this CrowdStrike hack affected the VPN, the virtual private network that Maricopa County elections were running on, right? And so, if you look at this is a poll book, and so basically MC Tech sends out the voter registration to all of these poll books via this virtual private network. And then the poll books talk back to MC Tech. And we think about every 15 minutes so that if somebody goes and votes, they register at the poll book. The poll book then will send the information over to MC Tech and say this person voted, and then MC Tech will send the data back over the VPN to all the different poll books to let them know that that person did in fact vote at Vote Center 1 and should not be allowed to vote again. And then the poll books, it's actually the poll book that tells the printer what to print, correct?
Yes. So
Yeah.
when a voter logs in on a poll book, then their precinct or precinct split, if there happened to be a school boundary that went across the middle of the precinct, determines what races should be on their ballot. And then that information goes to one of the printers. You have two printers, P1 and P2, attached to each poll book. And then that's the ballot that the voter fills out.
Right. And so it's actually, now let me ask you this. There were issues in the 2022 election with the printers down here printing odd-sized ballots. Is that correct?
Yes, it was a huge problem. There were the ballot was so long, there were so many races on it that Maricopa County went to a longer paper size. So they went to a 20-inch ballot. And obviously, if you're going to print something on a 20-inch piece of paper, it should be a 20-inch image. But for some unknown reason, a number of people got ballots that were shrunk by 5%. And so it was a 19-inch image printed on a 20-inch piece of paper. And that is not acceptable to the scanner because it recognizes, even if the human eye doesn't see the difference, it can tell that that ballot isn't the right size and isn't the right shape, and it will spit it back out. And I don't know if you have the video from places like Journey Church where people were putting their ballot in, it spit it out, they'd turn it over and put it in again, and it spit it out. Now, really, that's not necessary because the scanner's designed to accept the ballot any of the four ways you can put it in. But having the ballot ejected essentially means that voter wasn't allowed to vote in the normal fashion.
All right. And so the printer gets the specific information on what to print from the poll book, sending it the command, correct?
Yes, the poll book has pictures of what each ballot style looks like. So if you're in precinct 1, it has a picture of that ballot, and if you're in precinct 2 with Adams High School or Adams School District, then it has a picture of that ballot, and precinct 2 with Buchanan School District has a picture of that ballot. And so depending on what your residence address is, then the poll book will send the picture of the ballot you're supposed to get to the printer, and the printer just prints it and the clerk hands it to you.
All right. And so we started our show by talking about non-governmental organizations, right? And do any non-governmental organizations have access to this virtual private network and all the computers at MC Tech and all the poll books and all the printers? Shelby, do you know?
The VPN in most states is from a carrier like Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile, Cradlepoint, FirstNet. So that means that those companies have access to the data that's in the VPN. But the main NGO or non-governmental organization that also has access to county computers in many states and counties is called CIS. It's the Center for Internet Security. So this is a public-private partnership between CISA, which is a division of the Department of Homeland Security. So CISA is a government agency, And then CIS partners with the government agency, CISA, and the Department of Homeland Security to provide monitoring services for counties, school districts, things like that. And the typical installation is a computer called an Albert sensor that is installed inside the firewall of the county. And so it might be in McTech building, it might be in some other county building. But, well, let me just back up a step and say there's one more thing that you didn't need to draw on your picture, but it's there, and that's the county firewall. So there's a county firewall that is supposed to protect the county computers from hackers and things like that coming in. And it's also used to block unauthorized traffic from going out. You don't want county employees going to XXX.porn on the county computer. So the firewall can block traffic coming in and out of the county that's not authorized. What the Albert sensor is a computer that's installed inside that firewall. And what that means is it can see all of the county computers and report back to CIS if it detects malware, virus, denial of service attack, or whatever. So that's the official purpose of it. Now, what Washington State, Lincoln County in Washington State found out when they had a ransomware attack. So a hacker encrypted their files and said, unless you pay me so many Bitcoin, I'm not going to unscramble your files for you. And they said, wait a minute, we have this Albert sensor that's supposed to protect us from hacks, or at least notify us if we got hacked, and they never did. So that machine's worthless, throw it out. And so they got rid of it. So I don't know if Maricopa County has partnered with the Center for Internet Security or not, but many counties across the country have, and that basically provides CIS, this non-governmental organization, with access to all of the county computers.
Well, we do know at least that CIS has access to our judicial system, or have communications with members of our judicial branch of government. We also know that CIS has access to Maricopa County Attorney's Office. And so I'm making the assumption right now that they have access to our elections. Shelby, do you know more about that?
So I've done a little research on it, and based on what I've read, it appears that the Albert sensor is being used in Maricopa County elections as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we have just issued a public records request asking for the information of use and partnership. So we're waiting to hear back, and we'll report back to the public as soon as we know.
Yeah.
But I think it's a high probability that it is in play, and this has been discussed previously, but I wasn't able to find the actual agreements yet, so I put in the public record request, and we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, and so we also know that CISA that you talked about, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, an agency of the Department of Homeland Security, run, by the way, the man in charge was Alejandro Mayorkas, a man who very heavily politicized our national security agency institutions. And so they were engaged in the act of censorship of conservative speech, right? Do you know anything about that?
Well, in fact, the Secretary of State in Arizona at the time had basically a direct line to report people who were posting information that she didn't like, and then they would communicate that to Facebook and Twitter and say, take these posts down or suppress their reach.
Right. All right. Well, if they're willing to engage in censorship of Kari Lake supporter speech, right, in violation of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, it might be just a little bit more likely that they're willing to intrude into our elections here in the state of Arizona. But I'm not going to ask you if you would support that proposition or not. We'll just move on here.
Well, speaking of elections,
Mm-hmm.
right? When we go back and we look at what really happened
Right.
in 2022, and frankly, 2020, 2024, I think one of the biggest things is we have learned that they are willing to create whatever narrative they choose.
Mm-hmm.
And then when that narrative is somehow debunked or disproven
Right.
with credible evidence, they totally gaslight and change their position over and over. We talked about that with the file deletions, with the server, right? But I don't know if I can't remember. Walt, you might want to say something to this effect, but I remember being in the courtroom when Scott Jared testified on day one, and he talked about there was no disruption, there was no problem. He knew nothing about the 19-inch ballot definition issue. And then on day two, just totally undid that. Were you, I can't remember. Were you there at that time in the court?
I was not in the courtroom that day, but I was watching it live, so I remember it vividly. So the first day, he said there were no problems, everything went smoothly, nothing like this had ever happened before. And then at the end of the day, 5 o'clock or whenever the court session ended, the camera was still on, and you could see him kind of in the center of a circle of lawyers huddled around him, like they were having a very urgent conference. And then
right, what they did,
it was both.
Yeah, they actually, after day one, they went back to Maricopa County Tabulation and Election Center, back to MTech, and had a conference meeting there as well.
Yeah.
So
and you could see Scott Jarrett running around, like pulling his hair out, totally stressed.
He was actually like this.
Yeah,
literally.
He was literally stressed out of his brain because now they had to appear for day two and sort of change their testimony. Do we want to show some of that testimony?
Yeah, I think we should. Let's start with video one. This is Scott Jared telling Kurt Olson that there was no disruption in his opinion. He didn't believe that this problem caused any disruption on election day.
That's not a disruption when voters still had valid options to participate in dropping in those ballots in our secure door number 3, which is a similar process that 8 other counties use as their only option for voters to be able to return their ballots.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, you're not answering my question. My question isn't what other options existed for voters. My question is, would you agree that there was a disruption of at least 20% of the vote centers in Maricopa that caused delays in the voting process?
Objection, Your Honor. The witness has already answered this question as to whether he characterizes it as a disruption.
And I'll overrule. If you can answer it, you may, sir.
I'm not changing my response.
Okay.
All right.
So he says there was no disruption in Maricopa County during the election. It was okay because they could just put their ballot in a drawer 3 and everything went as planned, right?
Yeah, I've never seen an election the likes of what happened in Maricopa County in 2022, ever.
Right.
You know, and I'm 60 years old. I hate to admit that, but
It was according to Scott Jarrett, It was a well-ran election. Steve, can you put up image 2, please?
Well, maybe, because the people who won made it a well-run election. Who knows?
Oh, maybe. So what you're looking at here is a plot graph of the tabulator misreads that occurred across Maricopa County. Along the bottom is a list of every single vote center. And then going up and down are tabulator A and tabulator B, because the vote centers had 2 tabulators per vote center. And then the percentages you're seeing are the percentage of ballots that were misfed. So this is the percentage of failures that occurred on election day. And the red line you see across the bottom is the EAC standard, which is 0.2%, 1 in 500 ballots. Not one tabulator out of 444 tabulators in Maricopa County met the EAC standards. Walter, do you want to elaborate on this plot graph? I know you're familiar with it.
No, you've described it very well. And so the point is that machines are supposed to work. And that 0.2% means that if you put 500 ballots in, it should read at least 499 of them without any problem. And that was not the case for a single voting center. So that means every voting center had lots of ballots rejected. And in a minute, we'll talk about what caused some of those rejections. But every voting center had lots of ballots rejected continuously. And there's another graph that was in the Arizona Senate testimony that you and I, Shelby, both testified at Wendy Rogers' hearing, that showed that for every 30-minute period throughout the day, there were 7,000 or 8,000 problems across the county. And so it was a huge problem. And to say that there was no disruption, and to say that under oath in court, was a problem for Mr. Garrett.
Well, absolutely. And you heard Kurt asking in court, almost like he wanted to give Scott a chance to correct the record, right? He's like, so you're saying there was no disruption? And then the county attorney, I think that was Joseph LaRue, says, objection, right? And he's like, I'm not changing my answer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they knew.
Well, you know, and I guess maybe they want to change the definition of disruption, right? A disruption. What is a disruption? Oh, well, what Scott Jarrett actually said was, well, too damn bad. Throw it in door 3 and deal with it. And that's what Scott Jarrett was saying. This isn't a disruption. So what? Our system isn't working. Throw it in door 3. That's why we have the option.
Well, and it goes back to what we talked about last week and what many of us have been saying, and that's they do not care about your vote. It's really not about the voters. And so when they look at organizations like ours, people like us, and they say that we are here to disenfranchise voters, the opposite is actually really true. Right. They don't care about the sanctity of an individual's vote. They have no concern.
It's like Adrian Fontes, right? When he and his cohorts in crime, the governor and the attorney general, drafted the election procedures manual for 2024, they wanted to make it a crime to criticize an election official. Can you believe that? You know, they wanted to subjugate us to the will of the bureaucrat, rather than giving us transparency and openness. And that sort of demonstrates, you know, I think the level of animus that these people actually have for the people of the state of Arizona, the United States of America.
Oh, absolutely. Right? Look, let's get to the trial where he changes. Let's talk about the 19-inch ballot definition. So, Steve, can you put up video 3, please? This is day 1, Scott Jarrett's testimony, when questioned about whether or not it was possible that these images, these 19-inch images, were printed on a 20-inch ballot.
Sir, I want to go back to the earlier question about the 19-inch ballot image being placed on a 20-inch paper. Did you hear of any reports of that occurring in the 2022 general election?
I did not.
If that occurred, would that be a failure of Maricopa County's election process?
I'm not aware of it occurring, and I'd be surprised that there was a a ballot on demand printer that had a 19-inch ballot on it.
Okay, I understand that, sir. But
And the reason why is we did not design a 2022 general election on a 19-inch ballot. That ballot does not exist. The only ballot that exists is a 20-inch ballot.
and when you say we designed, who designed the ballot? Is that outsourced to another company, or is that done in-house by Maricopa?
In-house by Maricopa County staff.
What department would that staff fall under? Is there a specific name for it?
Our ballot tabulation team, so reports to me.
Okay. And do you maintain records as to the ballot definition that was created for the 2022 general election?
Yes, we have records of all the ballots that were designed.
And so I'll go back to my question again. If a 19-inch ballot image was put on a 20-inch paper in the 2022 general election, would that be a failure of your election process?
It would, if something like that happened, which I don't know how it would, yes, it would have been a mistake.
Could that have also been a deliberate act?
Again, you're asking me to speculate about things that I have no knowledge of occurring. So I don't know if it could have been a deliberate act or not. I don't believe that that occurred.
I want to start by saying Mike Lindell is not paying for this podcast today. It was just a clip we took from RSBN. And God bless Mike Lindell. I know he's dealing with his own legal issues right now, and he's been in court this week. So God be with him. Yeah. So what do you think of that, Walter? What do you think about Jared's day one testimony?
Well, remember, he's under oath, so he's on the stand in court, and so he has been sworn in to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. And so, under that oath, he has stated on the first day of his testimony that there was no disruption. It was just Plan A, Plan B. When the ballots weren't scanned, they would be put in door 3 and taken back to central count and scanned later. So that was just an ordinary, prudent fallback position to operate in that circumstance. And that he never heard of a 19-inch ballot happening and has no knowledge that that ever happened. So that's his sworn testimony on day one.
Good. Should we have a listen to what he says on day 2?
Yeah, but before we do that, I just want to point out for people, because this Scott Jarrett is still the election director for Maricopa County Board of Supervisors. And every time I watch this, my blood boils. Like, I take this so personal because he made that testimony. And then I remember Clay Parikh coming up to the stand to testify about the truth, about the 19-inch ballots being printed on, or ballot image being printed on the ballots, right? And we were celebrating. If you watch some of the footage of the court, I think it's the actual court cams themselves, you'll see us get very excited in the stands because we're like, here's the evidence, right? We've proven our case here. And I don't think we ever imagined at that point that they would recall Scott Jarrett back to the stand on day 2 and literally instruct him to perjure himself, not just on one issue, but 3 issues. And that's what we're going to show right now. And that's number 4, Jarrett knew.
Well, and just so it's clear, I mean, before they recalled Scott Jarrett, you got to remember, do we have any video of them at night at MC Tech?
You know, we don't. Okay, I should have put that in here, but we can put it out.
Of that. We can put it out. We'll put it out. We'll put it out on
Twitter.
We the People USA Alliance's account.
Yeah.
And people can watch it. So bear in mind that Scott Jarrett's testified. He just testified. And I think one of the key central issues is printing of a 19-inch ballot on a 20-inch piece of paper. I think that's crucial. So then Scott Jarrett is huddled with his attorneys after he gives his testimony at the end of the day. And then, boom, they're at MC Tech at night with Scott Jarrett pulling his hair out, right? And then we get day 2 testimony. So let's watch.
Yeah, let's go to number 4.
What I recall from yesterday's questioning was that there was a 19-inch definition, which that did not occur, ballot definition.
So if the back and forth between our question and answer shows me asking you specifically about a 19-inch ballot image being printed on a 20-inch piece of paper, you are now saying that you interpreted that as a ballot definition issue?
Yes, that's correct.
And you wouldn't think it would be relevant, even in that circumstance, to say, hey, we learned about this fit to print issue. Did you know about the fit? When did you learn about this fit to print issue?
When we started doing the audit reconciliation of those door 3 ballots, we identified some of those ballots had then a fit to paper issue.
And when was that?
I don't remember the exact dates, but a few days after Election Day.
So this fit to print issue that we're talking about, has this ever happened before in any previous elections?
Yes, it has.
When did it happen before?
So it happened in the August 2020 primary election, the November 2020 general election, and the August 2022 primary election.
Right. That's funny. Scott Jarrett knew, but on day 1, he said, "Oh no, I'd never heard of this before." Right?
Hey,
Day
Brian,
2,
can you tell me if one of us on our side, especially during that Kerry Lake trial, if one of us had perjured ourselves on the stand like that, to the extent that Scott Jarrett did, what would have happened to us?
well, I'd probably be sanctioned and all kinds of other things.
And what happened to Scott Jarrett?
Absolutely nothing. Yeah, he's still doing
Disgusting.
his job. In fact, he's got more power over the election department now, doesn't he? Because
Isn't there a term for that called two-tier justice system?
Yeah. And
Oh yeah,
so-
he's the sole
Yeah.
election director now because they've pretty much, castrated Ray Valenzuela.
Right. And I think a lot of that has to do with, and some people are critical of me for saying this, but I think Valenzuela was genuine in his testimony. He may have, when you're peeling a carrot, peeled a little bit more off than he should have, or something like that. I think, though, overall, that Ray Valenzuela was pretty honest in his testimony. He made multiple admissions that I think should have been more damning to Governor Hobbs's case and her defense and Maricopa County's defense, especially as it relates to how they handle mail-in ballots and the actual admission that on Election Day they don't maintain chain of custody count, right? So I think within his purview of the elections, he was at least honest in that regard, unlike Scott Jarrett.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can recall more moments where Ray Valenzuela was testifying where I was like, oh, that's really good for us.
Yeah.
Right? Because he was telling the truth.
Right.
Unlike Scott Jarrett. Now, I want to ask you about whether or not after listening to those 2 clips, okay, so you listen to him talk about it and answer Kurt Olson's questions. And then on day 2, he tried to play a little bit of semantics with this and say, oh, you mean a 19-inch image on a 20-inch ballot paper. I was just thinking about ballot definition. Do you want to talk about the semantics of that, Walter, and what you think about how they're playing that semantics with that whole issue?
Well, it's something that we run into a lot. So, for example, there was a voting machine manufacturer executive who was on the stand who was asked, do your machines ever connect to the internet? And again, he was under oath and he said, absolutely not. They don't connect to the internet. Well, as your picture showed, his machines, just like the ones in Maricopa County, do connect to a VPN, which, if it's a typical installation, would be through a hotspot from Verizon or AT&T or one of the other vendors. And so if you ask me as a computer scientist, what's the purpose of a hotspot? I would say the purpose of a hotspot is to connect your device to the internet. Well, he could say, no, our machines don't connect to the internet because they connect to Verizon's VPN. And the Verizon's VPN isn't the public internet. So it's like making a subtle distinction and not calling it out. But looking again at the first day's testimony, Kurt Olson asking the same question 3 or 4 different ways. And every time he said, 19-inch didn't happen, never saw it. If it did happen, it would be a mistake, but I don't think it happened. So he got the question rephrased multiple times, and then to come back on the second day and say, well, I must not have understood the question. So the parsing of words is something that's your department as an attorney, Brian.
Well,
the ballot definition is basically a photograph of what you want printed. And so if that photograph then is printed in its original size, when you take a picture on your cell phone and send it, it often gives you a choice. Do you want the original size, which is really big and might be slow, and maybe the person you're sending it to can't receive files that big? Or do you want a smaller size version? And so you can do the same thing on your desktop computer. When you're printing a picture out, you can say, oh, I only want to print this half size, so scale it to 50%. So in this case, the ballot definition file was a 20-inch image, and then somehow, some way, the system was instructed to scale it to 95%. And if you put 2 images side by side, the average human being would not see the difference between the two. They just both look like ballots. But when
do we have a ballot we can show?
You know what? I didn't put it up here, but
okay.
I can probably send it to Steve and we can throw it up a little bit later in the show for sure.
All right.
What I think it's important to also point out, not only did he say this didn't happen and he had no reports of it.
Right.
He also on day 2 admits that this was the 4th election that they know this happened in. So
it was an ongoing problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And so
if it had happened 3 times before, why hadn't they fixed it?
Right.
Exactly.
Well,
And
but not only that, right? He admitted that they found those ballots prior to his first day of trial.
Oh,
right?
Of course.
When they were doing reconciliation, they found that some of those ballots had been printed at a 19-inch image, whatever the scaling was that the poll book told the printer to print that image at, that he knew about that problem when he testified on day 1.
Well,
right?
and I think that's why we were so excited about the trial testimony on day 1, because we knew that there was no way that they didn't know, and they should have known on the day they were tabulating those ballots back at Central Count.
Right.
Because regardless of what we're going to hear shortly, those ballots could not have been counted by the central tabulators. They had to be duplicated.
Mm-hmm.
So what we knew is if they're claiming to not have knowledge, they either didn't count those votes or they duplicated all of these votes back at central count, right? So it makes no sense that they want us to believe that the tabulators at the poll sites couldn't read these ballots, but somehow their superpower tabulators at central count could. Right. And so they had to have known about this on election day. Is that correct, Walt? Or am I on to something there?
Yes, that's a very important point. So on the first day, he said, well, if there was a case when a voter's ballot didn't scan, then they would just be instructed to deposit in drawer 3 so that we could scan it later at central count. It's the same program. If it won't scan on the tabulator at the polling place or the voting center, it won't scan at central count either. So, and the reason is because the image was shrunk. So if you remember, the ballot has little black boxes all around the margin, which are timing marks. And that's how the scanner figures out which bubble belongs to which candidate. So it says, all right, pick a candidate. Candidate Senate is the bubble that's going to be on row 17, column 4. And so the scanner counts down 17 black boxes down the left margin and 4 boxes over on the top margin and says, okay, look at that intersection and see if that bubble is filled in or not to determine it. Well, before the scanner will evaluate the bubble to locate it, it inspects every single black box all the way around it. And I forget the number, but it's like 289 little boxes and 3 big boxes for the corners, and 1 corner's blank, which is how it knows whether you put it in right side up or upside down and can flip the image internally. And if a single one of those timing marks, which is what the little black boxes are called that line up where the bubbles are, if one out of those 289 or whatever it is boxes is the wrong size or isn't 100% black, it will not scan the ballot. And so if the ballot did not scan at the voting center, it wouldn't scan on central count either.
And thank you. Thank you for backing me up on this one,
Right.
because I've been having this discussion with people that the only difference really between the tabulators at the poll sites, the vote centers, and central count is one of them is like a larger, more industrial, right? It'll do more ballots quicker. But essentially, if they were to program the tabulators at central count to read ballots differently than the ballots at the poll centers or the vote centers, that would actually be a violation of EAC, right? I mean, that would screw up the whole election. So the fact that they're trying to claim that these two tabulators can read ballots differently in itself is a problem.
That would be a contradiction.
Yeah, I think what really happened and sort of where they sort of flipped the narrative was this effort to whitewash the fact that they had a problem somewhere within their system prior to those printers that had the power to tell the printer to print a ballot that would not tabulate, right? And so the way they tried to whitewash it is to say, oh, the printers were not printing the timing marks dark enough, right? And so then these tabulators wouldn't tabulate them. But, oh, no problem. They could be tabulated down at MC Tech. And so they sort of take these issues and they flip them in a way to whitewash. Well,
they convolute it, right? Yeah. They've done this since 2020 and other issues we've talked about. They take two issues and they convolute them to create confusion,
right?
And make the gaslighting. And I remember Scott Jarrett on the stand saying they were going to do a root cause analysis, right? Yeah, go ahead, Walter. You had something to add there.
Uh, yes, there actually was a problem with the printing in some cases. And the reason is that the paper stock for the ballots is extremely heavy. So it's 4 or 5 times thicker than a normal piece of paper. So ordinary copy paper is 20-pound or 25-pound paper. The specification from the manufacturer for ballots was 80 or 100-pound paper. So we're talking about something that's almost like postcard thick. Well, to understand how a laser printer works, it takes the electronic signal from the computer, the poll book in this case, and says, where do you want a black dot on this piece of paper? And then transfers that to something which attracts a little dot of black powder, and then presses that against the paper. And then the last step before the paper comes out, you notice that when paper comes out of this kind of printer, that it's warm. There's a heater that then melts that little speck of black ink into the paper. But the heater is underneath the paper. And so what that means is that if the paper is really thick, you have to have a higher temperature in order to melt the black dot of ink powder into the paper. And so there were cases where the temperature wasn't high enough, or the stock was too thick, or both. And that meant that the printing was a little blotchy. So remember, I said the timing marks, those little black squares around the border, had to be 100% black. If there was one white dot in the middle where that piece of ink didn't melt and fell off when the piece of paper came out, then the scanner won't accept it. So there actually was a problem with blotchy printing. And some enterprising poll workers said, well, here's a Sharpie, try blacking in the timing marks solid black and see if it takes it. And sometimes it would, if that was the problem. So if the problem was a good 20-inch image on a 20-inch ballot that just had a few blotchy timing marks, then you could black them in and get it to scan. But there's nothing you could do for a 19-inch image because the box is too small. The timing mark box is too small.
Go ahead. Producer Steve has a question for you.
The question's kind of for everyone. Do you guys remember, did they change the printers at the vote centers? Because we had almost a month of voting where ballots were being printed out and they were being fed through the machines, and we didn't have any reports of problems through this entire month of voting season. And then all the way up till voting day itself, that's when crap hit the fan.
Well, and it's
so what changed?
It's interesting you say that because, well, we actually have a video. I was going to skip it, but we can play it. But we have a video of Kurt Olson asking Scott Jarrett that question. Did this just happen on election day, right? But before we play that video, I want to give you a chance if you have any theories or thoughts on how the ballots at these vote centers that were being printed by the same printers for early vote, right? Because there were early voting centers, didn't have an issue, but on election day, they did have an issue. Do you have a thought or a theory on that?
I don't have any details on that. I mean, it's standard practice to have some spare printers available at the center location. And if a voting center calls in and says, hey, we're having problems with printer number 2, then a technician will pick up a spare printer and put it in the trunk and go out and see if he can adjust it. And if he can't fix it, then just swap it out. So that would be kind of standard procedure. The only other thing I could think of might simply be the heavy duty use. So these printers, you often ask yourself, why is this elevator so slow in a tall building? Well, it's because it was installed by the low bidder. Well, these printers are not the most expensive printers, and they sometimes have more problems when they are heavily used as they were on election day, or more heavily used. So that might have been affected. But I don't have any details about that.
And I think that was the focus of the McGregor report, which we're going to get to.
Yeah, real quick before we do, that makes sense what you're saying, Walter. What doesn't jive well for me is that these same printers were used through the entire month. The ballot definition, the ballot size, nothing about that changed through the entire month versus all of a sudden you have that problem on election day. Was a new ballot image uploaded? What's the common factor? The only thing that all these printers have in common is that they're all connected to the same cloud.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that, Steve. We're gonna.
Okay.
That's
all right. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that the people who are listening or watching that are logged in, that they fully have an appreciation of how deep this goes and how messed up this is, right?
Yeah, I agree, and I think we need to get into that. But we should start with Maricopa County wanted to make sure that the public understood what really happened, and so no, we can go ahead and skip that. So there was a root cause analysis that was done. According to Scott Jarrett, he said in court that there was going to be a root cause analysis, and they brought in Judge Ruth McGregor to do an investigation to get to the bottom of what happened in Maricopa County.
Yeah.
And before we really start talking about that, I just want to add, this to me is a prime example of convolution, where they convolute the issues because yes, there were printer issues and the timing marks, but that was a completely different issue than the 19-inch ballots, but they tried to explain them both away under kind of one concept. And that's the part where it gets a little tricky.
Right.
So
most of the McGregor report is very interesting because he says, sort of in the very beginning, the second paragraph actually, that the Maricopa County Attorney's Office retained me to conduct a focused, fact-specific independent review to determine why printers that performed successfully during the primary election evidenced problems during the general election. Right. And then he goes on to note that the issue of the 19-inch ballots happened during her testing, but there was actually no analysis of why that was taking place. There's just this sort of nebulous statement that says, yeah, we don't know why, and nobody else really knows why either, that these printers are printing out these off-size ballots. And so
wait, before we move on.
Yeah.
I want to point out, if you look at the image on the screen, there is an excerpt that we took from the bottom of page 2 of the report.
Right.
And I want to read this because this is the part that really gets me. It says, note that subsequent proceedings have established that all votes were counted, that most of the misprinted ballots being transported to the, quote, more powerful election central count tabulators, unquote, which tabulated them without issue. You can drop that. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, Walter.
Well, we already talked about that. That's not possible. So a 19-inch image is an invalid image. And so it's just like you stuck a piece of newspaper in, the machine says, that's not a ballot.
Yeah.
And
well, what about if the ballot had, print adhesion issues so that, some boxes were, not blackened all the way or irregularly shaped? Would the tabulators at Central Count tabulate those?
No. Like I said, every single timing mark, all 289 or however many, I don't know why that number sticks in my mind. It may not be right, but there are lots of little bitty black boxes around the entire border, and
Right.
then 3 big black boxes in 3 of the corners. If every single one of those boxes is not exactly the right height, exactly the right width, and 100% black, not a single dot of white in the middle of it, then the scanner says, hey, I can't be positive that this is a genuine ballot, and it spits it back out. And so that
Then
statement,
something would
they're
have
just
to be done
repeating.
to that ballot to make it
Well, yes, what they have
tabulated.
to do in a situation where a ballot does not scan, and there are other reasons. So there were mail-in ballots where people spilled their coffee on it, or they wadded it up by mistake and realized that, oh, that was my ballot, and they unfolded it, and it has a lot of wrinkles in it. So
Right.
if it won't scan, then there is an official procedure where they have 2 clerks transcribe that to a new blank ballot. So one clerk reads the ballot and says, on the first race they voted for this person, and somebody marks it on a clean ballot. And on the second race, they voted this way, and then they switch and read off the ballots and compare. And then they write on the new ballot in red ink, which won't scan, duplicate of ballot number so-and-so. And then on the other one, they write spoiled, not counted, and then they file both of them. So there's this process of making a scannable clone out of an unscannable ballot, and then they can put that in the scanner, and the scanner will read it.
Well, the unfortunate thing here is in Maricopa County, they don't really follow that process, but that's a whole nother conversation in that they have literally admitted, and they admitted it to Clay Parikh during the ballot inspection, they don't even have a system to remarry those duplicates to their original ballots. And they're supposed to be serial numbered so they can be matched together.
Right.
Also, they're doing it digitally here. So they do it on a computer screen where they duplicate those ballots, and then they print out those duplicates to be counted. So it's an even less secure system.
Yeah,
here.
I don't even think they're printing the duplicate now. I think they're just
Digitally
submitting
uploading it?
yeah, electronically. And I know during the 2020 election or the 2021 audit of the 2020 election, as we were going through all of these duplicated ballots, the law requires they have a serial number. Well, many of the serial numbers weren't present on duplicated ballots, and or the serial numbers were sort of almost as if intentionally placed over the timing mark so that you couldn't read the serial number. They were the same color and completely obscured. So you can't marry. We were never able to marry the duplicate with the duplicated ballot, and that's part of the problem.
So maybe we need to have you, Walter.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, maybe you need to come out and teach them how to do this. What do you think?
Well, I think you can, that your team could do an excellent job of that because you know the Arizona law better than I do. But I do know a federal law, Title 52 U.S. Code 21081, that says that for federal elections, there must be a permanent paper record with a manual audit capability. And what that means is I ought to be able to pick any line in the cast vote record report spreadsheet and say, show me the ballot that has these votes on it. And they could find that piece of paper. That's what a manual audit capability is trace it all the way back to the source document.
Right. Yeah.
Sounds like they might have trouble doing that with their system.
I just want to point something out. Can we pull number 6 up again real quick? And I want to go to the bottom left where it says both the Maricopa County Election Department, MCED, or the department, and the Maricopa County Recorder's Office personnel have provided all documents and assistance requested, right? this sort of strikes me as odd because this isn't in the purview of the recorder's office. And is this sort of an example of Stephen Richer serving as the sort of centralized figure in the elections department? He's the one who, he's the face of Maricopa County elections.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting that you bring that up.
Because there was a lawsuit about that, wasn't there?
Yeah, and in the shared services agreement, even under the early days of Stephen Richer, the tabulators were never under the recorder's purview. And tabulation,
right,
the count itself and election day are not under his purview.
Right.
But they had him out doing interviews on election day
right.
as a spokesperson for election day activities and the ballot counting, which I found incredibly bizarre.
Yeah, and I thought there was a lawsuit involving the fact that, he wasn't supposed to be, he wasn't the man running the elections in Maricopa County. And so maybe there was some lawfare used against Terry Lake. And so, okay, well, Steve, I'm going to talk to the bot.
Yeah.
But anyway, if we go to number 7, there's also some. Oh, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to say, as I recall, in Arizona, elections are ultimately the responsibility of the county recorder. Is that correct?
Well, no, it depends. There's a shared service agreement now. Statutorily, the county recorder's primary responsibilities are the mail-in ballots. And then tabulation is a function of the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors. And so there is a division in Arizona law between responsibilities. Now, they create what's called a shared services agreement that adjusts and modifies to the extent statute will allow some of those duties and responsibilities. So it really depends. But primarily the recorder, one could say, he's in charge of most of the election because most ballots in Maricopa County are mail-in ballots or some form of early ballot. So
okay,
go ahead and put up image 7 if you would, Steve.
I thought this was an interesting statement in the McGregor report only because we had a lawsuit involving Runbeck, right? And this is, if you look at the top left up there, it says Maricopa County's election system depends in several ways upon services and assistance provided by Runbeck Election Services, right? And we had Maricopa County Attorney's Office arguing before courts that, they're no different than, somebody, restocking tampons in the female washroom, right? You remember that?
Yeah.
I just thought that was, I'd throw that out there. But anyway, what this is looking at is sort of Judge McGregor, former Judge McGregor, her testing that she has done of the printers that were used during the 2020 election. And I think if we go to number 8, we can see that what some of her what we were talking about earlier, right? And so if we look at number 8, the top paragraph, and so Walter, is this basically what you were saying? During the time required for the fuser to recover to optimal heat after idling, the printer could experience an inability properly fuse the toner to the paper, which in turn would result in flaking and speckling observed on some of the printer ballots, i.e. what they're saying is the extensive use, the very, little downtime, I guess, was causing these printers to cycle improperly and to not print a good ballot. Would that be a fair assessment?
That's right.
And then she cites the weight of the paper as being having the greatest impact on printer failures. And so you were saying earlier that it involves heat, and so when you're trying to adhere the ink to the paper, then it requires heat to effectively transfer to that ink to the paper in a manner that's going to fuse it. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. And so,
I want to add here. Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, no problem.
Once again, when we get to the conclusion, they state they say tabulation in the more powerful central count tabulators.
Right.
During the 2022 general election, the procedure permitted tabulation of the misprinted ballots in Maricopa County. So they keep saying this falsity. They keep repeating this lie that these ballots that misprinted were just fed into these superpower computers in central count and everything was fine. And it's very disturbing to me.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from the fact you have the election director perjuring himself in court, you have this judge just regurgitating over and over again that these ballots were counted at central count without any kind of modification. And it's just perplexing me why they would continue that lie over and over again. You can take it down, Steve.
Well, obviously, she was just repeating what she'd been told and did not investigate it herself. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So there was no in-depth investigation based on her report and my review of her report of how many ballots, where are all of these ballots that had issues at one location on one tabulator that could successfully be tabulated or counted on another tabulator, right? They're running the exact same software program, so they both need to see the exact same thing, correct?
Yes. And the other thing they should have done, so you had it up a minute ago where they said that they did observe missized ballots, which is printing the shrunken 19-inch image in their investigation. It says that they did observe that. Well, then why didn't they take those shrunken ballots to a central counter and see if they would scan? That's the missing step. That's the missing next step. Is you say, okay, we're looking at a problem, we see the problem, but we're not going to check if the central count scanner could actually scan this shrunken ballot, which it can, but they didn't check.
Well, hold on a second. I want to make one more point on this issue with regards to the toner and the printers, right? And so I think this is a very important point to make. And this is a question I have for you as someone who has studied elections and elections departments and the technology necessary to run these very heavily centralized and very technology-driven elections, right? Elections department have technical personnel, correct?
Yes, they.
Oh, didn't hear you.
I said, yes, they have to have IT personnel in the department because voting machines are computers. So just like you have to have an IT department for the purchasing department to issue contracts and RFPs, you've got to have IT people to manage the computers that happen to be used as voting machines.
Right. And then whenever you buy all of this technology, all of this equipment, whether it be a tabulator or whether it be a printer or a tablet, they all come with user manuals, don't they?
Well, they used to. Now what they generally come with is a QR code that says, scan here for the user manual. In other words, print it out at your expense and not our expense. Right. But yes, there is a user manual.
Right. And so if you're a technical person with an election department and you're buying a piece of equipment, you need to know the technical specifications of that equipment, don't you?
Yes, although in this case, Dominion, who was the vendor for the voting system, had a list of approved printers. And so they basically told the county, when you buy our system, you need to buy a certain number of printers and you can pick one of the model numbers on this list, and I think there were two. I think there was an Okie
All
data
right.
model.
I want to add to that.
I'm going somewhere different with it.
Okay.
If you just give me 1 second.
Okay.
Steve, can you put up number 10? This is Okie's response. Now, Okie is on, I believe, Dominion's. This printer is specifically on Dominion's approved list. But Okie's response to the McGregor report and to Maricopa County's statements about what was taking place is very interesting.
But we have to add, I don't think we ever did. We have to add that they threw Okie under the bus in that report, saying that it was the Okie printer's fault.
Right.
And so that prompted Okie to then come back and get into a kind of a public exchange with the county attorney. So I just want to add that. Go ahead.
Right. And so if we look at this letter from Okie following the issuance of the McGregor report, there's some interesting stuff on there. And it says, you did receive a manual with our printer, and it basically, this is Okie basically saying, had your technical people and had former Justice McGregor read the manual, they would have known that the maximum weight of paper that should be used in this printer was 80 pounds. Do you see that?
Okay. Yeah, and so this is a really important point, Brian. I'm glad you brought this up, and that is system integration. So Dominion has a list of approved printers. They pick an Okie data printer that's on the approved list. Dominion has a list of approved paper weights, 80-pound paper or 100-pound paper. And so they pick 100-pound paper, but they didn't check to see that the Okie data printer model that they selected could handle 100-pound paper. So that was a failure of the system integration, that they did not make sure that they could operate together.
Now, should that have been part of former Justice McGregor's investigation, determine, whether or not they actually have technical people that understand the capacities of the equipment they're using, so that we don't have problems like this during, what is arguably the most important public act people engage in this country?
Well, before he answers that, I also want to point out, and I was going to say it earlier, Dominion and Runbeck. Runbeck is a certified printing agency of Dominion.
Yes.
And Runbeck is the one who sells these vote center ballot on demand systems that interface with Dominion. And they are also experts in paper weights and styles and printing. Right. So between Dominion and their chase down the hole, Runbeck knew exactly what ballot weight paper it was, because they work on the ballot definitions.
Right.
Because they print them for the mail-in ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And they work very closely with the county on this. So, I believe we cannot discount the involvement of Runbeck's lack of aptitude in this as well.
Right.
And that they should have known these specs on these printing equipment, because they are the ones ultimately setting up these vote center ballot on demand printers.
Right. Well, they got owner's manual, so they have that implied knowledge. Mm-hmm. Right. They know what these printers will handle, yet they chose to use they chose going into election day, where they knew there was going to be very heavy Republican turnout, to use these printers that had a maximum paper weight capacity of 80 pounds for effective printing. And they used them anyway with 100-pound paper.
And so, going back to the McGregor report, so she was hired to do the investigation, and then she in turn hired a husband and wife team to actually carry out the tests. The first thing that team should have done is to look at all the manuals, look at all the specifications, collect all the data, and then when they had a question or something didn't line up, to call Runback, to call Oki Data or whatever, to get more information from them. So they should have pursued it further. So I'm not faulting the investigation that they did. I'm just saying it didn't go far enough. And it certainly
Let me
didn't
ask you a
determine the
question.
cause.
If you were the one hired, let's just hypothetically, you were a contractor and somebody approached you and said, we'd like for you to do a root cause analysis investigation into what happened in Maricopa County. What would you have put as your scope of practice? What would you have done as an expert to actually chase down this root cause analysis?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would have done would have been to collect every possible piece of data that was available. So logs from all the tabulators, internal logs from all the printers, because when something is detected as a failure, for example, that's how we know how many ballots inserted failed to read, is because the tabulator recorded that in a log. And so to collect all of the data that was available, and then from the operation of the machines, then from the machines that were ordered, so the contract that was signed, the model numbers, the EAC approval, because did the EAC approve this model printer being used with this version of the software? And that's another question or a problem to me in Maricopa County, is that the Secretary of State approved Dominion software version 5.5B, but the EAC never approved that version. And so why was Maricopa County using a version of the software that hadn't been approved by the EAC? That'd be a question I would want to drill down. And then when I got to the point of, all right, I've collected all the information I can from the past election. Now they've set up a poll book and some printers here, and I'm going to work them and work them hard. So type as fast as you can. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I've been pumping gas and I punch, no, I don't want your higher priced additive added to my gas. And then I want to go ahead and punch which grade of octane I want, but it won't let me punch that button yet. And so I would punch the keys as hard as I could, as fast as I could, to see if I could make it fail. And obviously they managed to make it fail because they observed that there were 19-inch images printed on 20-inch paper. Now, to find out what's causing it, you have to sort of do two things. Playing detective, the two things you do in tracking down a technical problem like this, or any problem of investigation, broadly speaking, is you look for something that's there that's not supposed to be, and you look for something that's not there that should be. So what's missing and what's extra? So if a policeman is walking down the street and he sees a car with 3 tires on it and 1 empty wheel, he says, okay, is the tire missing because they had a flat and took it to get it repaired, or did somebody steal that tire? So there's something missing. If the policeman is walking down the street and there's a pool of fresh blood next to the car, you say, okay, that's not supposed to be there. Why is that pool of fresh blood there? So you look at all of the things, and in the case of the printer, I would get out my infrared thermometer and measure the heat of the fuser before, after, idle, after printing 10 ballots, etc. And then tell the suspects, say, what could have caused this problem? So again, this is any kind of investigation. It doesn't have to be detective working on a crime scene, although I really like Sherlock Holmes. My favorite passage in Sherlock Holmes is Dr. Watson saying, "I say, Holmes, how on earth could you determine that that person was the criminal?" And Holmes says, "Elementary, my dear Watson. There were 5 suspects. And after eliminating 4 of them, no matter how unlikely, it had to have been the 5th. So you make a list of what could cause this, and then you systematically go about either eliminating it or validating it. If you still can't do it after that, then a standard thing that computer manufacturers will do is set up a whole room. So I don't know how many printers they were testing, maybe 3 or 4, but set up a room with 100 printers in it, and then have them just print ballot, 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 ballot. Then you're going to get a lot more failures, and you can collect more data and narrow it down. But that's what it's all about: is what are the possible causes and which ones can you eliminate?
It's like when you take your car to a mechanic, right?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about this.
Right.
You take your car to a mechanic, and there's a misfire, right? So the first thing the mechanic's going to do is make a list of what could cause this misfire, and then they're going to start at the most obvious, and by process of elimination, find the issue, right? So in this case, Walter, what would be your top list of potential causes, ways that those printers printed a 19-inch ballot definition image on a 20-inch ballot definition image at 19 inches on a 20-inch paper, however you want to describe that. But what would be the top ways that you could have the shrink to fit issue with the ballot?
Well, again, this is a part of a general troubleshooting or debugging process. Is if you ask any cybersecurity expert, they will tell you that the most common ways that a computer can be subverted are pre-programming. So that's what the program told it to do, and the flaw is in the program. The second one would be insertion of malware or a virus. So this is a change to the program that wasn't intended by the person that wrote and installed the program. So pre-programming, insertion of malware or a virus. And then the other 2 most common ways of subverting a computer would be local access or remote access. So local access, someone sits down at the keyboard and types something they shouldn't be typing, and that affects the operation of the system. Remote access, they log in over the internet or the VPN or the Bluetooth or the Wi-Fi or whatever other way they have of connecting it. And this, again, is a risk that the more components that are networked together, the broader the attack surface is. So if you're trying to keep your TV from getting stolen, you can lock your doors and windows, and that goes a long way to keeping it from being stolen. But if the TV is on the network and your neighbor can connect by Wi-Fi and suck your TV out of your house over the Wi-Fi to their house, they can steal something from you without ever having to bother picking the lock on your door or breaking a window to get in. So pre-programmed modification of the program by malware, a virus, local access, remote access, those would be the first 4 most common suspects for any computer subversion.
Well, we know that prior to the 2020 general election, they had their LNA testing, and then subsequent to that LNA testing, we know they at least changed the software and the tabulators, and then did not, I believe, they didn't conduct additional LNA testing after that, correct? It was all sort of secretly done?
That's correct. And we do have evidence that also occurred in 2022.
Right.
Because that issue has been brought up again. And we had the video footage,
right.
and they said that it was a standard update that was approved by the Secretary of State.
And so we don't know, it's possible if they're sort of subversively um, changing the software on the tabulators, that likewise additional software was added to the poll books and the other objects. Now, so the poll book is what sends the commands that the printer relies on, correct?
Yes. So the poll
And
book has pictures of all of the ballots for all of the precinct and precinct splits, and then
right, and so
it sends
would it
a.
be
It picks
possible?
the right.
Would it
Go
be
ahead.
possible, for example, if someone put malware on the system, or if someone was accessing the system from outside or even inside, or could it be written into the program? Something that says print every 50th ballot on election day at 19 inches.
Yes, but that would come under the category of pre-programming. So you just
Right.
say, put in a command like that to say every 50th ballot is shrunken, which means it will be unscannable.
Right. And then that, they could reproduce that ballot, and then they could count it, and one would think all would be well, right? But if you're talking about a lot of people going to vote centers on election day, and then every umpteenth ballot, whatever the number happens to be, printing off size and not being scannable, with somebody standing in line, putting it in multiple times, trying to have it scanned, having to get a new ballot because it won't scan and they don't want to do the door three. And what does that do to line?
Right. Well, it creates a backlog, right? I mean,
Creates a backlog. Yeah.
we saw that in Anthem, even where I voted in 2022, the poll center that I was at, I didn't get to cast my ballot until nearly 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
And that was in Avondale, which wasn't even one of the vote centers that they tried to claim was a problem. And I remember being there electioneering that day and watching them bring another printer out of a woman's trunk and take it into the poll center to connect it. It was the trunk of her car, and they hauled it in and connected it. And the other interesting thing is, and when we think about where it occurred and kind of the areas that was most affected, these the same technicians, what they call T-techs, did not operate in all of these same locations. Yet to me, and I want to ask you about this because we kind of talked about this before, Walter, the local manipulation, meaning a technician, a T-tech, accidentally changing the settings on the printer, would seem to me to be the least likely probability, because it would have required either the mass incompetence of multiple employees across Maricopa County or a massive collusion of employees. Yet the McGregor report says we could not determine whether this change resulted from a technician attempting to correct printing issues, the most probable source of change, or a problem with the internal printer. So they're actually saying that's the most probable cause of the issue. And I'm saying I think it would be the least likely cause for such a mass scale issue. And I'm curious your thoughts on it.
Well, I would tend to agree with you, because with 223 vote centers and 2 tabulators each, well, I think there was 1 or 2 that didn't have 2, but so we're talking basically over 400 machines. To have some pool of technicians go to all of those 200 something sites and change and make the same either mistaken or deliberate change to the settings on 400 printers is unlikely to me, because of the sheer amount of work. So if you rank them by how much effort it would take to perform local access, it would require a lot of effort. Remote access requires much less effort, but it still requires connecting to 223 vote centers. That could be done by a script or a program. So that's kind of on the borderline between being a lot of work if you had to do them one at a time remotely, or if you could write a program that would just say ping, 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 fix all of them. So that's kind of on the borderline. The pre-programmed or malware or virus, I think, would be higher on my list of possible causes, and that's just kind of where I would start. Is like you were talking about. You have a problem with your car misfiring. Well, let's just say your car wouldn't start. Well, if the mechanic didn't first check, is the battery dead? Are you out of gas? And do you have compression? Then I don't want to pay that mechanic by the hour. I want him to check the most likely things first. And so the most likely thing, and remember, when we talk about subverting a computer, the printer itself has a computer in it. So there's a computer and a program. It's burned into firmware, although that can be modified. And it's the computer in the printer that moves the paper through the printer at the right speed, checks the temperature of the fuser to make sure it's hot enough, gives you a little blinking light when you're out of paper and things like that. So there's a computer in the printer, there's a computer in the poll book, and then, of course, there was a computer that generated the ballot definition files. I would agree with Stephen Richer on that. I think it's unlikely that they had two sets of pictures in the computer, a 19-inch set of 19-inch pictures and a set of 20-inch pictures. That to me is less likely, and I would put that further down my list of things to look for if I were investigating it. So I'm not faulting what the McGregor team investigated. It's just they didn't go far enough because they quit too soon in tracking down what caused it, in my opinion.
Well, right. I mean, what they were looking at, first of all, was just the toner issue, right? The toner adhesion issue. It seems like that's all they wanted to look at. Now, they could have gone further on that toner issue and had a much better understanding had they actually communicated with Oki. They would have learned, or had they actually read the owner's manual for the printer, right? It's like your car, right? You should read the owner's manual for your car. If you put too much oil in your car, more oil than spec requires, engine oil, do you know what'll happen to your car?
You're going to have problems.
Yeah, the oil will froth, and then it will harden, and it will seize your engine, right? So too much oil is just as bad for your car as too little oil. And so by not going and digging down into the printers that Runbeck was recommending using with paper, Runbeck was recommending using in Maricopa County, these people all impliedly know that the maximum paper weight for these printers to get print quality is 80 pounds. They stopped. They didn't look. They didn't dig into that problem. But then they completely just sort of dismissed why these printers every now and then will spit out an offside ballot that cannot be tabulated. And that, I think ultimately, if I had to say, I would say the reason for people to ignore this issue is to sort of keep it hidden in the shadows that a large part of our elections take place over the internet.
Well, I think so. And I will tell you this, nowhere in the McGregor report did they look at potential software alterations or manipulations. That was not even addressed.
Right.
It's like they totally convoluted the two issues and then kind of blew over the 19-inch ballot images that were printed on the ballots. And I agree with you. I don't want to impose nefarious intent to the judge when it could just be lack of knowledge or incompetence,
Well,
right? I mean, but
it gets to the first. It gets to the first sentence of her report, and I'm not saying there's anything nefarious either. I think this investigation was intentionally limited to a specific issue, and that it was so limited, and that her team was given access to so little information that it was designed to find a certain outcome, right? And it says right here, printers, let's see, focused, fact specific.
right.
A focused investigation is one that is looking at one specific issue. And the more important issue that I have is, the potential implications for people accessing this VPN, which travels through the cloud, is traveling through all these network computers, because we know we have the non-governmental organizations. And so that to me is the most significant, and it's what truly Maricopa County wants to hide more than anything.
Well, and it's the issue I don't think they're ever going to talk about, right? And it's the reason why they deny many different public records that they don't want people to see, or they fail to respond to public records and a lot of these issues because they don't want to have to admit that there is a possibility for these machines to be altered and hacked, right? Whether that be pre-programming at the side of the manufacturers or the people setting up the ballots, or whether it be some nefarious person in some foreign country hacking into the system. They want to avoid any potential that the reality of that becomes public, right? So they're willing to do whatever they can to conceal that, including, to me, sometimes lie or gaslight about issues that are actually pretty simplistic. It's like, when your kids eat an extra Oreo and they lie about it versus, committing murder. I mean, there's a far big difference, but they're willing to really, really lie and gaslight sometimes on the really small issues, because I think it will point us in the right direction of what's actually possible with these machines. I don't know if you have anything further on the Maricopa thing, but when we talk about machines and what they're capable of, Dr. Dougherty here, Walter, has just released a very stunning report on Arapahoe County, Colorado.
A very shocking report.
Oh, yeah. And I would love to have him talk to the people about that. Do you have any final thoughts on this Maricopa thing before we move on?
Well, I think it's important where you're talking about narratives and how different people involved promote them or alter them. A common narrative is 2020 is behind us. We need to be looking forward.
Right.
And I think that's a big mistake, because if we don't find out the problems with the 2020 election process, election equipment, phantom voters on the voter rolls, counterfeit ballots, whatever, then we're going to have those problems in 2024. And sure enough, we did. And we're going to have those problems in 2026. So the fact that there have been at least 4 elections now, maybe 5, where there has been no root cause analysis of the shrunken ballot image. And that's just one problem. That's just one issue, is that problem is still sitting up there nagging and saying, I'm not fixed. I'm a problem. I'm not fixed. I'm a problem. And for people just to say, we need to look forward and, work harder to get more people that
doesn't that fall in line with the whole idea? A nation that doesn't know their history is doomed to repeat it. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. When we teach this ignorance of, okay, just move forward, vote harder, vote more. and forget about what happened in the past, aren't we just setting ourselves up for a repeat failure of history?
Well, and that's why we're doing this episode on this specific issue because, I think that we're looking at malware or we're looking at some type of software commands that are input into the code that run these machines that are causing these problems. And so, until we talk about it, until we make it a huge issue with the public, until the public understands what's really happening with this issue, rather than hiding things behind reports that are looking at secondary issues, we will never fix the problem until the public understands what's really taking place.
Well, and I love that Walter's joining us today to talk about this really shocking and startling evidence in Arapahoe County, because it shows that we're not all sitting in our basement wearing tinfoil hats talking about these secret Chinese or Russian hackers going into the machines and making changes. And we constantly hear there's no credible evidence. You keep feeding a lie and you have no credible evidence. Well, with us, we have, to me, I think one of the foremost experts in this mathematical, scientific computer technology that there is. I mean, they cannot question your credentials, Walter, and you have the goods. You have the evidence that they altered the cast vote records in Arapahoe County. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you get started. And if you want me to put up some of these images that we discussed, I have them available, and let's just see where the conversation goes.
All right, fine. Well, thank you. And just to tag on to your comment before, is that people have to be willing to look at the evidence and then to evaluate it. So there's a saying, I don't know who it's attributed to, there are none so blind as those who will not see. So when somebody says, I don't see any problem, but I'm not looking for it, then you question that. So my basic operating philosophy is look at the data. So what are the facts? And then ask questions. And so there's a team of researchers who have been looking at counties in Colorado for some time. And not too long ago, Ed Solomon, who's a mathematical genius that recognizes patterns, found some unusual patterns in the cast vote record in Clark County, Nevada, which is the Las Vegas area. And so there's a lawsuit going on now in Clark County, Nevada, of Thompson versus Secretary of State. And one of the exhibits is showing that there's an unusual pattern in Clark County, Nevada. Remember what I said about when you're looking at big data, you look for patterns that are there that shouldn't be, and for patterns that should be there that are missing. And so part of Ed Solomon's analysis for Clark County was, hey, this strange pattern that shouldn't be here looks just like the pattern in Arapahoe County, Colorado. And so a lot of other researchers started looking into it, and everybody kind of has their own little specialty. So I'm a computer scientist and engineer, so I look at computer hardware and software, but I'm also a mathematician by training. And so I look at statistics and analyze data as well, but specifically ratios in the cast vote record. So that's something that has been very informative ever since I first saw an unusual pattern that indicated manipulation in Pima County and Maricopa County in 2020. So a group of researchers all looked at Arapahoe County, Colorado. And if you're not familiar with the Colorado geography, this is the eastern suburbs of Denver. So Littleton and Aurora are in Arapahoe County, just east of of Denver. So we all looked at it from our own perspective and then shared what we had found and confirmed it. And then on May 27th, we held a press conference on the steps of the Colorado State Capitol in Denver to present the results of this. And so
would you like us to put up that graph?
In just a minute. So
okay.
I just want to give a shout out to the other researchers. So I compiled all of this work, not all of it. I compiled much of the research that was done on Arapahoe County into this report. And then Mark Cook, Ben Cotton, Roger Fuller, Clay Parikh, Draja Smith, Sean Smith, and Jeff Young all signed the report, as well as concurring experts that agreed with this report and its conclusions. So the report that we presented then was the facts about Arapahoe County cast vote records and the questions that those facts raised. So to start with, I have a news flash for you. Conservatives tend to vote conservative, no matter what the issue is. Liberals,
I don't believe
tend
that.
to vote liberal.
A lie.
No matter what the issue is. Republicans tend to vote Republican, no matter who the candidate is. Now, once in a while, people will find somebody that they don't like, and so you'll find Republicans saying, nah, this race, I like the Democrat better, or vice versa. But historically and nationwide, it's relatively small, well under 10%. So partisan races are obvious. So you've got somebody running as a Republican or somebody running as a Democrat or some other party as well. But many of the issues that are also on the ballot are also partisan. So in Colorado, statewide in 2020, there was Amendment B on the ballot, which was to repeal the constitutional amendment called the Gallagher Amendment from 1982 that put a cap on homeowners' property taxes. Now, let me ask you, do you think conservatives are more likely to keep a cap on their homeowners' property taxes or to raise it and say, I'd like my taxes to be raised? Well, it's pretty obvious.
Yes, conservatives want lower taxes.
And a cap, right, for sure. Yeah. Some mechanism to prevent the government from increasing their taxes.
That's right. So the Gallagher Amendment had been in place for nearly 20 years. And it said that of all the property taxes collected in the state, no more than 45% of it could come from homeowners. And then every 2 years they would recalibrate. And so the purpose of it was that the taxing authorities would not get out of hand and say, oh, well, we'll just raise the tax on homeowners so we can have lower taxes on businesses or whatever. So it basically protected the homeowners from having to pay more than 45% of the total taxes in the state. So the election, so that Amendment B passed, which repealed the Gallagher Amendment. And sure enough, in the intervening or the subsequent 5 years after the election, some people's taxes doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled. So yes, their taxes did go up. So the conservatives were right. If this gets repealed, our taxes are going to go up. The first clue that there was something wrong with the election results in Arapahoe County came from a researcher at Yale whose specialty is he's a political scientist and statistician, and his specialty is ticket splitting. So the kind of ticket splitting he usually looks at is in the races, like, did you vote Republican for president, Republican for senator, but then you voted for a Democrat for a U.S. representative or state senator or whatever. So that would be not voting for the same party for all the races. And he discovered that in Arapahoe County, in the U.S. House race, Ken Buck, who is a Republican, won the Arapahoe County vote out of 3,888 votes but 77% of those votes were from Democrats. Well, Colorado is a very blue state. And so if you say 3/4 of the Democrats voted for the Republican for House, that doesn't pass the smell test. You say, nah, something's wrong here. And so he wrote a very polite letter to the Arapahoe County Clerk and Recorder, and who's responsible for elections in Colorado. It's different in every state, but in Colorado, Clerk and Recorder is one office, unlike Arizona, and the Clerk and Recorder is responsible for elections. So he wrote a very polite letter and said, I'm a researcher, I'm looking at ticket splitting, and it's inconsistent that 77% of this Republican's votes would have come from Democrats. And how did he think they came from Democrats? It was because those ballots had voted for Biden for president. So the ballots aren't labeled, this ballot was cast by a registered Republican or a registered independent or whatever. But if you, there were
it's similar to what we saw in 2024 in like 5 states that overwhelmingly went for Trump, yet the Senate seats went to the Democrat, right? It kind of that same sort of difference.
Exactly. So this is something that's inconsistent. And so he asked them to take a look at their cast vote record and see. So he wrote this letter back in October of last year. And then in April, the Clerk and Recorder posted a rather peculiar notice on their website that said, we were notified of a possible problem by this professor, and they named him, and we investigated his hypothesis, and he was right. And so we redid the redactions in our cast vote record, and here is the right cast vote record. Well,
here's the correct one.
Yeah. So there are two problems with that statement.
You can't make this up.
We gave you the wrong one. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So there are two big problems with that statement.
The first time.
I mean, the first one is that a redaction is deleting or obscuring. So if you buy a piece of property and in all the papers associated with your deed, your social security number is on there, then it gets filed with the county clerk, but deeds are public records. However, if I go and request a copy of that record, the clerk will black out your social security number. That's redaction. So it's obscuring or deleting data. That's what a redaction is. And Colorado state law does order the redaction of precinct results if there are less than 10 votes in the precinct. So the theory is this will make it harder for people to figure out whose ballot belongs to which voter. It's not a good argument, but that's the law, is that if there's less than 10 voters, they can delete those ballots from the cast vote record report. Okay, again, what is redaction? It's obscuring or deleting, and that means erase those 9 rows if there were just 9 ballots in that precinct. So those don't appear in the cast vote record. So it says, so what the county said was, we did the redaction wrong the first time for the 2020 election. So we deleted or obscured the data wrong. And now we went back to the original and deleted or obscured some more data. And now we've got it right. And now Ken Buck, the Republican, doesn't have 77% of his votes for Democrats. And so everything is fine. And they sent it back to the Yale researcher, and he said, yeah, looks good to me. You can't change votes on a ballot. That's a federal crime. So the cast vote
So are they claiming when they were supposed to redact it, they just scrambled it all up? I mean, that's their claim, right? We accidentally just mixed everything up.
It looks like part of the problem was that one time they sorted by precinct number, and another time they sorted by cast vote record sequence number, and did that on the first half of the ballot and the second half of the ballot. So I'm going to simplify the picture. It's like you took a bunch of ballots. Let's say the ballot was just 1 page. It was really more. there were 21 candidates for president, including Kanye West. So it was a long ballot, maybe 100 bubbles on a ballot. So let's just say it fit on one page, and you took all these ballots and you cut them in half, right down the middle, and then you shuffled the bottom halves, and then taped them back together. Well, that doesn't change the outcome of the election, because there's still as many yes and no votes and still as many Trump and Biden and Kanye West votes as there were before. It's just now they're matched to a different voter for the top half of the ballot. And so that is the effect of what the cast vote record that they released in 2025 for an election 5 years before looks like. If you can go to that graph of it's Exhibit 5, I think it was the last
Exhibit 5,
or maybe next to it has Exhibit 5 down in the lower right corner of that first set of slides, not the one that's all graphs.
Okay, so I show Exhibit 5 as this one. Is that correct?
Yes, you got it. That's the one I want. So you'll notice here down the left-hand side, the first column says which CVR. So that says, are you looking at the 2020 version of this ballot or the 2025 version of this ballot? And then CVR number 1. So that is the first ballot that was tabulated. So remember, cast vote record is simply an electronic record of the voter selections. And then underneath that, CVR number 2 is the second ballot in the cast vote record report with 2 rows for how this ballot looked in 2020 and how this ballot looked in 2025 and so on. So this is the first 5 ballots in the cast vote record. Now, let's go back to the top line of numbers. So it says which CVR 2020, it's CVR number 1, it's the first ballot. Vote for Biden, there's a 1. Now here for the bubbles, a 1 means black, a 0 means white, or filled in and not filled in. So that under Biden, a 1 says...
We assume it's a Democrat voter.
That's right. So not going to be too many conservatives or Republicans voting for Biden. So there's a filled in bubble for Biden, and the next column says a 0 under Trump. They did not fill in the bubble for Trump. Now, why is it important to report all the bubbles? And there were actually 21 bubbles for president. I didn't have room to put them all in. It's important because you can only vote for one. So if they had blackened in Biden and Trump, or Biden and Kanye West, that would be an overvote. And the rules say you skip that race and go on to the next race and see how they voted for Senate or whatever. So there are two columns for president, and I just gave the Biden and Trump columns. The next 2 columns are for Amendment B to repeal Gallagher. So a yes means I want my taxes raised, and a 1 means I want my taxes capped. I don't want my taxes raised. And then Amendment C was charitable gaming like charities that run bingo games. It was changing the rules on who could do that and so forth. So this first ballot did not change. So in 2020, the bubbles, if you read them as black and white bubbles going across CVR number 1, it was black, white, white, black, white, black. In 2025, it was still black, white, white, black, white, black. So they didn't change the first ballot on these races. Now, it probably did change further out on other races. I didn't look that far to see if there was no change. But out of 354,247 ballots, there were only 5 ballots that didn't have 1 change on it. So the changes here are marked in pink. So let's look at ballot number 2. Again, 2020, they voted for Biden, did not vote for Trump, did not vote yes on Amendment B, did vote no on Amendment B, did not vote yes on Amendment C, and did vote no on Amendment C. But in 2025, all of a sudden, they voted yes on Amendment B and yes on Amendment C. The Democrat voted like a Democrat in 2025, where they had voted like a Republican in 2020 on Amendment B and Amendment C. and similarly for the other ballots. So the pink are the bubbles that got changed. Now, you can't do this. So this is a record of the choices on a ballot, and it's a federal crime to alter a ballot record, Title 52, the U.S. Code. So that's what they did, and they said, we got it right now. And I and the other researchers said, well, you admitted that it was wrong and the 2020 CBR was wrong, but now you're claiming the 2025 is right, but it was altered, so it can't be right. And then we kept looking and found more problems. So let me give you a chance to chime in on this so far before I go on.
Well, about all I'm going to chime in on is that I'm in complete disbelief that an election official would misrepresent the truth. Yeah, it was sarcasm, by the way.
Well, I find it curious how everything in the cast vote record was messed up, right? And they come back and say, oh, whoops, we made a mistake. We gave you the wrong cast vote record. Here, we fixed everything. Here you go. And all of this occurred, and just miraculously, nothing impacted the result. I find that very interesting that they make all these changes, and yet somehow all of the final results just miraculously were accurate.
Well, there were some very slight differences in the totals, but not enough to change any race. So there were a couple of races that the final totals were maybe less than 10 different. So it didn't change the outcome of any of the elections. It just eliminated the unbelievable, implausible, impossible thing of 77% of Republican Ken Buck's votes came from Democrats, or that Trump voters voted to raise their taxes, their property taxes. So it eliminated that. What it didn't eliminate was some more patterns. And so if you can switch to the first graph, it's labeled Exhibit 1 down in the bottom right corner of that same file that you're on. So go back a few pages to
So I have the original, Prop B original graph.
Yes.
Okay,
It says Exhibit 1 in the lower right corner.
Okay, so while he's pulling that up, I just want to say I find it so convenient that no matter what we find, no matter what proof we present, when they finally have to admit there's an error or a problem, they always say, but, nothing that impacted the results of the election. Right. Nothing in elections seemed to impact the results. So I thought it was funny when you said it didn't impact the results significantly, because that seems to be a consistent theme with we can rewrite the cast vote records, we can kill all of these vote centers, we can do all these things, but it never impacts the results. The results are always accurate and reliable. You can put that graph up.
Well, that is a common argument, but it's completely false. If there's one ballot that got counted incorrectly, the election results are not accurate. So
I agree 100%.
It doesn't matter to me if it changed the outcome of the election or not. If it was counted wrong, then the results are not accurate. And that
was a disenfranchised voter.
That's right. So the U.S. Constitution guarantees every state a Republican form of government, and that necessarily implies that there are accurate and auditable elections. Because if there aren't, then you don't have a country. And then 14th Amendment, equal protection and due process. And this was actually quoted by the Supreme Court in the decision in 2000 on the Bush versus Gore race, to say that if there's any ballot that did not was not evaluated by the same standard as other ballots. So in the case of Florida, it was the hanging chads. So you've seen the famous picture of the auditors with a magnifying glass looking at a punch card and saying, well, the Bush Chad is a third of the way pushed out, but the Gore Chad is a half the way pushed out. So neither one is punched all the way through. So I think that they intended to vote for Gore, and the auditors sitting next to him said, no, that's an overvote. They voted for two people. You can't count that ballot. So that was if the ballot, if there's one ballot that's not accurate, then that violates 14th Amendment. In my opinion, I am not a constitutional lawyer. I defer to Brian on that. Okay, let's look at this graph. So this is the percentage of no voters on Amendment B, and no in this case means no, I do not want my taxes raised. So this is a rolling count of what percentage of Trump and Biden voters voted conservative on Amendment B, that is no. So what you would expect, so the red line, and by a moving window, in this case, it was about 10,000 ballots, a little over 10,000. So I'll just round it off and say, you'll notice that the leftmost red dot on the graph isn't at 0%. It's after you've looked at 10,000 votes, what percent of the first 10,000 votes, so we'll call them ballots 1 to 10,000, what percent of the Trump voters voted no? And it looks like about 44%. And then the next red dot, slide the window over and look at ballots 2 to 10,001, and then look at 3 to 10,002. So it's a sliding window of 10,000 ballots to say what percent of Republicans, defined as Trump voters in this case, voted no, I don't want higher taxes, and what percent of Democrats voted no. Well, the curves ought to be very different. So you ought to see the red curve way above 50%. I mean, Trump voters are definitely conservative, and they definitely don't want higher property taxes. So that red line should be way above 50%, but it's not. The blue line should be way below 50% of people saying.
I'm sorry, Walter, can I interrupt you a second? I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this right, to make sure that the audience is understanding this right. In a country that is so divided that there are riots happening in LA, and where our legislature is basically completely ineffective because everybody votes a partisan line, this graph is saying that the Republicans and Democrats voted in precise, almost precise lockstep with one another on this issue.
That's right. So for the entire election, as you're counting votes from left to right, percentage of ballots counted. So you start out, you count the first 10,000 of votes and put a dot on the graph. And then you slide the window over and count ballots 2 through 10,001 and put a dot on the graph. As you're counting them left to right, the percentage of Trump voters that voted no is almost exactly the same as the percentage of Democrats. In other words, there was no partisan split. That Republicans didn't and Democrats didn't vote any differently on a partisan issue. And in other races, in fact, there was another question in Colorado on abortion, and that has occurred in multiple other states. If we have time, we'll see a slide in another state where there was an abortion question, and Republicans and Democrats voted exactly the same on it. And that just doesn't pass the smell test. You say that's not possible. Well, in this case, there is a blue line there. It's hard to see on the black background. But if you look closely, you can see a few places where the blue and red lines are not identically overlapping, but they are so very, very close that it's just not believable. So they're two big red flags here. So one red flag is that Republicans and Democrats are not voting differently on a partisan issue. when the lines ought to be spread apart. The red line ought to be close to the top and the blue line ought to be close to the bottom. And then the second
So when this
big
evidence
problem
came out, I could see why Arapahoe County would be like, uh-oh, we need to complete a whole new cast vote record because nobody's going to buy this. Because it's just,
that's right.
it's not statistically possible. And I don't think you need to be a statistician or a mathematician or have any special credentials to look at this and say this is not statistically possible.
You're right. And that is the beauty of graphing things. So remember I said there were something like 100 bubbles on each ballot. Now with 354,000 ballots, multiply that by 100, and we're talking 35 million bubbles. You could look at 35 million bubbles, and if you looked long enough, you might see that there was a strange pattern here. But you put it on a graph, and just like that, you say, those shouldn't line up. So let's go to the next graph, which is Exhibit 2.
Okay, Steve, if you would please pull up 13.
And we'll see what it looked like. Well, would you look at that? Conservatives voted conservative and liberals voted liberal, and they didn't vote the same at every moment in time. They didn't vote in lockstep, and the curves aren't parallel anymore.
Right.
I can believe it.
And that's the way you would traditionally expect to see people vote on a highly partisan issue.
That's
and
right.
That's the way you would expect the graph to look for that proposition.
That's right. So you expect to see a wide separation between Republicans and Democrats or conservatives and liberals on a partisan race, like for president, or a partisan issue like taxes or abortion or whatever the case may be. And so that makes it much more believable. Okay, I think that's probably all I'll take time for to talk about Arapahoe. Did you want to discuss anything about this before we look at other counties and other states?
Yeah, I mean, I just find it fascinating how 5 years later, all of a sudden everything looks normal and the results didn't change. So like it just I'm nearly speechless, and anybody that knows me knows that's a rare place to find me.
No doubt.
Well, it certainly is. So let's go to the other set of graphs that I sent you. That's all graphs. And could you put up figure 3? That's Clark County, Nevada.
Clark County, Nevada. Yeah, so that would be 15. Yeah, so the Clark County, Nevada, this is a cast vote record being plotted out. Is that correct?
That's right. So this is a cast vote record where we're looking at, again, a partisan presidential race. So voting for Trump or for Kamala as a proxy for, is it a conservative or a liberal voter on this ballot? And then looking at state question number 3, which I forget what it was, but it was definitely a partisan. It was ranked choice voting in open primaries. So that was definitely a partisan issue. And so
you are kidding me. That was the issue here on the bottom graph.
Oh, well, on both of these, this is the same data presented 2 different ways. So
gotcha.
on the top graph, what you see in red is the Trump voters who were opposed to open primaries and ranked choice voting. And you can see that it goes between about 55% and 65%, but it's definitely above 50%. So the Trump voters were voting on the conservative choice on state question 3. And similarly, the blue line is mostly below 50%. So the Kamala voters were indeed voting for the liberal position on being in favor of open primaries and ranked choice voting. So they satisfied one test by voting differently. So the conservatives and liberals, or Republicans and Democrats, did vote differently in this race, but they voted in lockstep. So when one batch of ballots, in this case, the window was 13,000 ballots. So you could start anywhere in the cast vote record, just throw a dart and say, I'm going to start at ballot number 274,698 and take the next 13,000 ballots. That the percent of Republicans voting no and the percent of Democrats voting no would have the same ratio or the same distance between them. In other words, if you take what the Democrat percentage was, so take the very leftmost dot, the Democrat percentage was about 46%, and the Republican percentage was 57. So call it 56 and just say add 10 points to the Democrat and you'll get the Republican percentage. For every single block of 13,000 consecutive ballots in the entire election. And to see that these are in fact the same curve, the bottom graph, the figure 4, is basically taking the change from one to the next. So for the mathematicians out there, this is like graphing the derivative, is to say, how fast did one go up or down and how fast did the other one go up or down? And now you can see that when the blue graph goes up, the red graph goes up at the same rate and comes down at the same rate. In other words,
if a person who doesn't really know what they're doing, if they were to just kind of graph this out in a broad general scope, they wouldn't necessarily see anything wrong. Right. But when you narrow it down to like the different blocks, that's when you identified the pattern.
That's right, because the pattern depends on the sequence. So this is a point that I try to make on examining election records, is that recounts are good, risk limiting audits are good, but they only look at the total vote or the statistical likelihood of the total vote in the case of a risk limiting audit. They don't look at the sequence to say, how did you get to that total? And it's only by looking at the sequence that you can see this kind of manipulation, or the kind of manipulation that I first found in Pima County and then in Maricopa County in 2020, where instead of the curve being basically flat for a cumulative ratio after the first 10% or so of the votes, the ratio of Democrat to Republican was not only not flat, it was sloped downward at a slope of 2-to-1, predictably, so that if you knew that after counting 50,000 votes, Biden had 73% of the vote, if you counted another 25,000 votes, you would know he had 72%. And you count another 25,000 votes, he has 71%. And it just goes click, 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 all the way down to 65% at the end of early voting and the start of election day. And
this alignment occurred, every 13,000 ballots, this kind of alignment occurred. Wouldn't that indicate some kind of like a programming or an algorithm or some kind of internal programming to have it be that precise?
Yes, this is too much work to do by hand. So to take 443,000 ballots and sort them in an order that for every block of 13,000 consecutive ballots, the change in Republican no votes compared to the previous window of 13,000 votes is the same percentage change as the Democrats from the previous block. So this has to have been done by a program. It's not something that you could believe would be done manually by hand. So big red flag, need to dig deeper.
Well, I got a question for you.
Where did it happen? Who did it? And you asked an interesting question a while ago. Let me just throw this out as to why Arapahoe County might have felt the urge to go back 5 years and clean up some inconsistencies from that record. It could be purely coincidence, but there was a case filed in Nevada, Thompson versus Secretary of State, that used Arapahoe County's lockstep motion as an exhibit to say Clark County, Nevada looks just like Arapahoe County, Colorado, that this is not a problem that exists only in one county in Nevada, but it exists in Colorado as well. And so that declaration and information by Ed Solomon and Andy Thompson, who's the plaintiff, was filed last fall. And
let me ask you
it's
question.
Possible that someone might have been concerned that the same lockstep motion in two different states would be a bad thing to present to the court. So if one of the records got changed not to have lockstep motion, then that would take away the argument that this is a multi-state problem. So I don't know.
Now you need to be careful, Walter, because they're going to start calling you a conspiracy theorist like us and say that you believe there's some kind of mass conspiracy to hide election crime. So
let me ask you a question.
I just report what the data says and ask questions about it. And so the data says they look alike, and I'd like to know why. Go ahead, Brian.
Would you support all election equipment and machinery being run on open source software?
No way.
No?
No.
What about software where at least the people can see? Because here's the problem I have, right? I can look at these charts and this data and this graph you're showing me, and that requires some pretty significant coding, doesn't it? But more than that, it would require somebody with the ability to understand all of these billions of lines of code to figure out.
Okay, this is an excellent question. It comes up a lot. So the first question, which you didn't ask, but that often precedes it, is, well, Walter, you're a computer scientist, so you must love computers and think that we ought to use computers for everything, and especially for elections. And I say, no, it's because I'm a computer scientist and I do understand computers that I don't want computers used for everything, and especially not for elections. Because
no, I understand.
Okay, now to your actual question about open source, did you ever hear of Heartbleed? That was a bug in an open Heartbleed. So go to Wikipedia and type in as one word Heartbleed. So it was the name of a bug in a piece of open source software that was widely used around the world. And it made that software completely vulnerable. Well, it was open source. Everybody could see the code.
I understand
why
that.
didn't somebody find the problem before it was years that this bug existed? Why didn't somebody find the problem first? Here's the reason. The reason is because if it's open source, I don't have to pay my programmers to debug it. I just copy it off the internet and say, we're just going to use that little module from somebody else. And now I'll pay my programmers to do the part of the program that is special to my company's products. And so it's like the tragedy of the commons. So if nobody is paying programmers to look for bugs, no programmers are going to look for bugs, except the few people that really devote themselves to doing that. Now, let me give you one specific case. I can't tell you the details, but I'll just say our national laboratory at Los Alamos, which has responsibility for developing, testing, et cetera, all of our nuclear weapons. Their processes and programs, everything is highly computerized. So their best team of programmers was given a 1,000-line program that had a bug in it. They were not told what the bug is. So the program appeared to work fine, but they were told there's something wrong with this program, find it. And after weeks of looking at just 1,000 lines of code, the top team of programmers couldn't find it because it was hidden by somebody who was a little smarter than they were, or put it in a corner that they said, well, nobody would ever hide something in that corner of the program, and they weren't able to find it. So I will tell you again, I'm not bragging, any cybersecurity expert or expert programmer can hide something in a very small program that you will never find. So open source is not the answer.
It's interesting because before the 2020 election, there was the fire, gosh, the name, the big 2020 hack.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
You know what I'm talking about. They actually hacked.
SolarWinds?
Huh?
SolarWinds?
SolarWinds. They actually, the hack was ingenious because they actually hacked CISA, right? And so if CISA, which we talked about earlier, is dealing with all of our election software and our machinery and computers, then the hackers who hacked CISA would have been able to actually get into Maricopa's VPN and other counties' VPNs, because if CISA has access and CIS has access, and they've both been hacked by SolarWinds, then the entire system is vulnerable.
Well, when people say, oh, our election machines aren't hackable, I bring up things like this and say, okay, how many of you in the audience have gotten a message from your hospital or your bank or whatever that there's been a data breach and it may have included your personal information?
Right.
Add to that the Office of Personnel Management that has all of the classified details of all of our intelligence community individuals. They got hacked.
Yeah.
The Navy has a red team who is available for assignment to try to hack public-facing government computers. So some government agencies, say Social Security, I'm kind of making the story up, but you'll get the gist of it. So Social Security decides, hey, we ought to have our website tested. So they call up the Navy and say, can you guys see if you can hack our website or if there's anything wrong with it? That Navy red team, batting 1,000. They've never found a government computer that they couldn't hack. And so if all the government computers are hackable, all the banks are hackable, OPM is hackable, CISA, that's supposed to be protecting us from hacks, is hackable, then there must be something magic about election computers that they're the only computers in the world that aren't hackable.
Right.
Well, I love that you talk about the fact, because you know computers, you're kind of one of the first ones to say no machines, right? And I think we all agree here that that's a good thing. So we had a viewer send us a clip right now when we were having this discussion that we want to play, because when we talk about people who really know what's going on, understanding the importance of what it takes to secure an election. The Runback president and CEO actually makes a statement, basically, according to our viewer that sent it in, makes a statement for in-person voting and paper ballot and precinct polling places and on-site tabulation. You want to play that, Steve, if you would, real quick?
Do you see the day where people could vote, say, directly from their cell phones?
That's a great question. We used to get that a lot prior to 2016, and then with all of the concern around Russian or Chinese influences after 16, it really tailed off. With paper, you can always go back to a hand count. Look what they did in Georgia, right? There was concerns about the tabulation equipment. There was concerns about were all the ballots processed correctly? Were more ballots returned? All of those things can be dealt with paper copies. If you have a digital file, there's always going to be some level of concern about corruption, data corruption. It doesn't even have to be bad guys trying to do something, but just data corruption, mishandling of the data, bad formatting of the data, and then of course the actual hacking is a possibility of the data. With paper, you just sort them into piles and you can count the votes. And paper gives that confidence that should give that confidence that the election was conducted properly.
So how about that? That's the CEO of Runback even saying, if it's digital, it's corruptible.
There's a saying in the computer world, the last programmer in wins. So if I've written a program and you insert a virus, which is a change to the program, then it does what you said and not what I said that the program was supposed to do. Now, let me say one more thing about that. I would be comfortable with using scanners for unofficial early results if you did hand counting. However, if you do it in small precincts, it's not necessary. So if you do it in small precincts, less than 1,000 or 2,000, then you get 20 of your friends and neighbors, half Democrats and half Republicans, to volunteer as poll workers. You're done counting by 9 o'clock. You take the results on the window, phone it in to the central office, and have a block party and send in pizza. There's none of this waiting till 3 a.m. or 5 days later or a month later in the case of California. Well, who won that House seat or not? I don't know. We're still counting votes. And this is another telltale in Maricopa is if you look at the rate of tabulation. So when they give these little press announcements and say, as of certain time, we have counted 83% of the expected ballots, or 83% of the ballots that were cast. And then 8 hours later, we've counted 86%. And then a week later, we've counted 87%. It shouldn't have taken another week to count 1 more % of the ballot. That's something's off when they come up with a report like that.
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, what we can take from this is we don't trust that AI is not going to try to take over the world. That's what really scares me, is that AI really is going to start voting on our behalf. But whenever we have these machines, you always have, as we were shown on the whiteboard, these points where our elections become vulnerable, right? And so, how many countries in the world do voting the way you described earlier? You just divide it up into precincts of 1,000 to 2,000 people. You go there and you vote if you live in the area. The people count the ballots that night and then send their results down to central count, which adds them all up. And that's what we used to do in this country, right?
Right. Well, most countries, and certainly most large countries, do not even allow mail-in voting because that is that's the easiest thing to inject additional ballots. particularly when you have unattended drop boxes. So if somebody can make a copy of a ballot, they can make 10,000 copies of a ballot and just go drop it in a drop box with no video surveillance on it, nobody signing in, a chain of custody, nobody checking IDs. So a lot of countries don't even allow mail-in voting at all.
Right.
The other thing that some people say is, well, like France has so many million people and they can count it in one evening, but their ballot often is just for one race. It's not for 185 different races. And if that is a problem in counting, then the solution, we already have the solution for it. So 25 years ago, I lived in a very rural area. And when I went to vote, they handed me 3 ballots. So there was a blue ballot with the federal races on it, and a green ballot with the statewide races on it, and a pink ballot with the local races on it. And so I filled out the 3 pieces of paper and put the blue ballot in the blue box, and the pink ballot in the pink box, and the green ballot in the green box. And so by splitting up state and local races on separate ballots, they could even be done at different times or on different days. So lots of times city council or school board will be in an odd numbered year because you have the federal elections in even numbered years. So we already know the solution to the problems that arise from having too many voters and too many races on one ballot in too short a time. We already know the solution to that, and the solution is not more computers in the process.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up, did you want to talk about the Frederick County cast vote record you plotted out? Do you want me to put that up?
Yes, that would be figure
Frederick County, Maryland.
Right.
Number 16.
That's figure 5 at the bottom.
Okay. So we spoke about this one, and I think the biggest thing that was important to point out on this one was to clarify that this issue isn't based on one type of election software or another. So do you want to talk about what you're seeing here and kind of the differences?
Yes. So all of the counties that I've described to this point have used Dominion equipment, but the entire state of Maryland uses ES&S. So this is a different vendor, but we still have this lockstep pattern. But here, interestingly enough, the lockstep pattern is separated. Focus on the green and yellow lines toward the bottom of the graph. So the first third, they are in lockstep, but they're separated. And the last 2/3 that's in the white circle, the yellow and the green lines are almost identical. So yellow was the predominant Republican position of voting no on question 1 on abortion. And then green was the percentage of Republican voters for Representative Parrott who voted yes, which was the Democrat position. So here you have an inconsistent pattern where conservatives are not voting for the conservative position on abortion, and they're voting in lockstep with Democrats for the last 2/3 of the race. So these patterns where the curves ought to be far apart and not the same shape, they're so close together, they overlap and they are the same shape.
Interesting. And so when people say, well, maybe we need to get rid of Dominion and go with the S&S, or the problem is with the S&S, and maybe we should use Hart InterCivic, the reality is it really doesn't matter which voting equipment they use. it's vulnerable in the hands of some, a wrong player or somebody who wants to manipulate the result.
Well, that's right. So this lockstep motion on partisan issues and nonpartisan behavior on what is a partisan issue is in multiple counties and multiple states with multiple vendors. So it's a nationwide problem, which means it will have to be addressed by a federal investigation.
So basically, what we're looking at is, we can, or whoever can target specific races. So, for example, if you didn't want to draw too much attention and you wanted you wanted one race to win, you could just focus on one race and manipulate the outcome of that race using this computer technology.
It could be done on one race or on a pair of races or even on multiple ones. So in Arapahoe County, there were about 5 partisan issues where this same lockstep behavior was observed, but there were a number of other partisan issues that they were clearly separate. And so it seems the data would seem to indicate that the manipulation is only in selected races.
Okay.
So in your report, you wrote a conclusion, and it was a very kind of short and sweet conclusion of what you determined, you and your team determined should happen based on the evidence uncovered in Arapahoe County and Clark County and Frederick County. Steve, can you put up graphic number 17, please? You want to talk a little bit about this conclusion? And,
sure.
tell the people what your final conclusion was. And also, if you wouldn't mind, maybe share what you think the average citizen can do to help with the situation.
The conclusions of the Arapahoe County report are as follows, and this was my conclusion and also the concurring experts, is that the official cast vote record for the 2020 election, which was redacted in 2022, is not plausible. So there were inconsistencies in Democrats voting for the Republican for Congress and conservatives not voting conservative, conservatives voting for Trump, but not voting to keep a cap on their taxes. Number 2, the new 2025 version of the CVR altered the votes by means of directed shuffling of the federal election votes. So the patterns that emerged in 2025 were different from the patterns in 2020, but they appear to be related to shuffling like half of each ballot and then taping the pieces back together. Altering votes in election records is a crime. That should be obvious that you can't do that. So there are federal laws about that. And that means that an immediate investigation by federal authorities is called for. The obvious ones would be in the Department of Justice, the FBI, because that's what the Federal Bureau of Investigation does, is they investigate the possibility of federal crimes. So look at the evidence in Arapahoe County, see if there was a federal crime committed, and if so, take the appropriate action. And the other office in the Department of Justice would be the Office of Civil Rights, because all of the voting laws that we have, for example, Title 52 of the U.S. Code, which I've cited several times, originated in the 1960 Civil Rights Act, because voting is our fundamental civil right. So if we don't have honest, accurate, auditable, transparent elections, we don't have a country. And so this is the data that we have found and the questions that it raises. And we look forward to a thorough investigation, finding out what the truth is and taking appropriate action to see that it doesn't happen again. We can't just ignore it and say, oh, we need to focus on 2026. We've got to fix the previous problems.
I agree 100% because without our fundamental right to vote, it's fundamental to every other right we have as citizens in the United States of America, right? If it can be taken from us, the government can quash every other right we have. And that's why it's so critically important. So thank you for your excellent work and thank you for being on our show.
Yeah, we greatly appreciate you. We hope to have you back in the future. You know, I love that you brought up mail-in ballots. I try and make it a point every time we do one of these shows to sneak in there that mail-in ballots are one of the greatest scams perpetrated on the American people possible. And so you gave me that opportunity to sneak that in again.
Right.
And
That's
you know,
right.
I thank you. I have such a great respect for you, and you know, I think we've all kind of shared that battlefield together and continue to share that battlefield together. So thank you for being here. Thank you for all that you're doing to expose everything that's going on in our elections so we can get back to where we need to be.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Shelby and Brian, for having me on. Good to see you.
Have a
Good
good
to
night.
see you.
Bye.
So, surprise. 5 years later, they say, uh-oh.
Right. You know, this right. It's time, you know, that America needs to realize their election systems are hackable, and this is why I consistently refer to what we have in the United States right now, not as you know democracy as we would otherwise know it, but as a sort of a controlled democracy,
Right.
right? Where yeah, they might let a certain candidate win, but then they're going to rage and burn our cities down until that candidate has no power to do anything, right?
Well, I think the final thing here is for those that take the time to listen to our podcast, to read these reports, look at the evidence yourself. You don't have to take our
Yeah.
word for it. Google it. It's out there. I'll try and get it up on our website, the Arapahoe report. You can read all the facts behind it, all the information on the Kerry Lake findings and what happened in 2022. It's all publicly available. You can follow our Twitter feed, other people's Twitter feed. It's out there. Get the information and act on it. I think the most important thing is don't allow yourself to be convinced that we can vote our way out of this mess and that there's nothing more we have to do. Remember that until enough of us stand up and start making a I don't know the right word for it, but just really making it a priority to bring back transparency in our elections, we're going to be repeating this cycle every 2 years.
Yeah.
It's going to be nonstop and constant. So write your legislators, inform yourself, learn about your elections, and get involved. You can reach out to our organization. There's other organizations out there that you can volunteer for. Go to town meetings, go to county meetings, just get involved.
Yeah, and really quickly, I mean, you've got a lot of people in the Trump administration that are saying, "Oh, we need to go to paper ballots," right? And this is what a lot of people don't understand. You got places in Georgia where people don't have paper ballots.
Right.
They go vote on a machine. They never get a paper ballot to feed into a tabulator. And so that's sort of misleading the public as to what really the problems are. Because, yes, they should have paper ballots in those states and in those jurisdictions, because then there's an auditable paper trail that's not dependent upon some machine whose numbers can be changed. But the most significant, the biggest problem we have in the United States of America is that our federal government is infinitely hackable. Our federal government has direct access to all of our elections, from the federal government through the state government to our counties and local jurisdictions. and they are just as infinitely hackable. And this is what the problem is, that we have so centralized our elections and we rely so intensely on all of these technologies and computers that we are losing control of our system.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us.
Steve has something.
I think producer Steve wants to do the wrap up.
Just two quick things. I'll let you do the wrap up. One, I wanted to say this 2 hours ago, but CISA didn't get hacked. CISA is an intentional Trojan horse, in my opinion.
Oh, I agree, 100%.
The hack is built in.
I agree.
There is no hack. It's a pretend hack.
Mm-hmm.
But CISA having access to critical infrastructure is the Trojan horse, allowing for their air quotes intended hack to infiltrate all of these things.
I agree with that.
So when you hear, I had somebody, speaking of that, Steve, I had somebody talk to me yesterday about the fact that there's this new big push to create a federalized voter registration and e-poll book system, one national database.
Scary.
Well, they say, it'll cut down on cross-county voting, cross-state voting. And I'm like, oh, hell no. Absolutely not.
Did you say prostate voting?
Cross-state voting.
Well, same difference.
Do that again.
Steve, what do you think of that? I mean, we are unrailed now.
We've been live too long, and so now we're starting to get a little goofy. We're going to need to wrap this up in a minute.
I'm going to introduce the newest member of Teresa and my family real quick before we say goodbye. He's saying goodbye right now because he's got to go to the bathroom. This is Lincoln, and he's a wonderful, wonderful new addition to the family. So good show.
Go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to say it's kind of tailing off what Brian was saying earlier, is that if we don't have free, fair, transparent, and auditable elections, then we only have the illusion of choice.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care if you believe in a republic or a democracy. All of it's an illusion if we don't know for sure that we're winning or losing fairly.
Great.
So with that, I will say, if you are still on the mail-in ballot list, if you're still prioritizing convenience over security, then I want you to reconsider, because right now it's a society of convenience that has put us in this position, and we need to start discouraging that. And remember that Thomas Jefferson said, I would rather live, I might misquote this, but I would rather live in a tumultuous freedom, a dangerous freedom, than secure tyranny. And, it's not going to be an easy battle, and it's not convenient, and you might have to drive a little further to cast your vote, but you will truly be free.
Don't be the lion in the zoo.
So have a good night.
Peace.
Thank you.